Hey guys, tonight we stand before a painting that doesn't seem quite finished, and maybe never wanted to be. The light is low, golden, flickering across a varnished surface where a woman's eyes follow you, soft yet suspicious, alive in a way paint shouldn't be. This, they say, is the portrait of a duchess who tried to disappear from her own likeness, a brushstroke that fought back. A face that decided it had seen enough of history and wanted out. You probably won't survive this level of aristocratic drama, Duchess. Though don't worry, nobody's dueling tonight. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a narrow gallery, somewhere deep inside an English manor that has long since given up pretending it isn't haunted. The air tastes of dust and candle wax. Around you hang the usual suspects of noble portraiture. Solemn dukes, powdered wives, sullen heirs who didn't live long enough to make history interesting. But at the end of the hall, past a line of creaking floorboards, there's her, the Duchess of Selgrave, though the title changed hands so many times that even curators whisper the name differently depending on the hour. She sits in her portrait draped in pearls, her shoulders bare beneath the gauzy suggestion of silk. Her expression is nearly serene. Nearly, because when you look twice, and you will, her mouth tightens and her gaze drifts ever so slightly away from you, as though her attention is fixed on something just behind your shoulder. That's when the guide whispers the usual line. They say she tried to vanish from her own portrait. It's the sort of thing you'd expect from a bored intern or an overzealous tour brochure, except there's something about this particular canvas. Something too deliberate to be dismissed as a coincidence. The records say it was painted in the late 1760s during one of those years when powdered wigs were at their fluffiest and scandal was practically a social sport. Her husband, the Duke, was wealthy, temperamental, and deeply fond of commissioning paintings of people he didn't particularly like. His Duchess, born Lady Constance de Miraval, was his third wife. His first died of melancholy. His second fell from a horse that had been startled by lightning, though the sky that day was famously clear. You see where this is going. The portrait was supposed to immortalize her beauty. Instead, it immortalized a mystery. Historians still argue whether the painting's unfinished quality, the faint haze around her right hand, the soft blurring of her left eye, was the artist's style or something that happened after. When restorers examined the work decades later, they found traces of a thumbprint pressed into wet paint, but the pigment was warped in a way that suggested it had been pushed from inside the canvas out. You lean closer, maybe too close, and the smell of turpentine seems to sharpen. There's a small crack beneath her jaw, one that follows the delicate curve of her throat like a scar that's healed badly. The plaque below it reads, attributed to Sebastian Lorne, circa 1768. Sebastian Lorne, a name that appears in both art catalogues and medical case studies. He was the court painter whose nervous breakdown made headlines in early Georgian society. His final letters mention a woman who would not stay still and a portrait that refused to dry. The story goes that after weeks of sleeplessness, he locked himself in his studio, shouting that his subject had stepped out. The next morning, he was found collapsed beside his easel, his brush still wet, his heart utterly stopped. The painting, the very one before you, was perfectly intact, though no one could explain why there were faint footprints in the paint along the floorboards leading away from the easel. Of course, these are just stories, maybe. You glance around the room again, Other portraits seem dim by comparison, their colours faded, their varnish clouded by centuries of air and neglect. But hers gleams. Even under artificial light, the surface shimmers as if it's still drying. The eyes follow you wherever you move, with that peculiar double focus common in old paintings. Except this time, it feels less like optical trickery and more like someone thinking about where you'll walk next. Some swear they've seen her blink. Others say the pupils contract under light exposure, though repeated experiments have shown nothing of the kind. A restorer in the 1920s claimed he saw her expression change between morning and afternoon sittings, her smile fading by degrees as if she were running out of patience. And then there's the strangest detail of all, there's no preliminary sketch of this portrait. For an artist as meticulous as Lorne, that's almost impossible. His other commissions all include pages of graphite outlines, notes about colour and lighting, even written apologies to his subjects for taking too long. But with the Duchess, nothing. It's as if he sat down one day and painted her directly from life, or from memory, or from something else. A faint sound breaks your focus. The slow creak of the gallery door behind you. Someone enters, maybe another late visitor, maybe just the wind. The air shifts, the candles gutter. You blink, and for a heartbeat, her eyes don't follow you anymore. They're looking somewhere else, over your shoulder. A museum security guard once said he heard whispering in this room at night. A woman's voice repeating the same sentence over and over. When he finally made out the words, it wasn't a curse, not even a plea. Just, not like this. That's the thing about history. Sometimes it refuses to sit quietly on a plaque. It squirms, mutters, rearranges itself until you notice it again. The Duchess's story begins here, with a painting that might have captured too much, an artist who might have seen too deeply, and a woman who may have realized too late that immortality in oil is not the same as being remembered. And as you linger there, the candlelight flickers across her cheek. For just a moment, you swear her expression softens, almost relieved that someone's still looking, or maybe that someone's finally noticed what she's been trying to say all along. You've seen portraits before, of course, queens, saints, powdered nobility, whose eyes seem to say, "I endured corsets and candlelight for this." But none like her. The Duchess of Selgrave seems half frozen, half fleeing, and the deeper you stare, the less sure you are where she ends and the paint begins. Before she was a duchess, though, she was no one in particular. At least, not in a way history bothers to remember. The record keepers couldn't even agree on her name. Some called her Constance, others used Colette. One obscure French registry lists her as Marie-Constance de Miraval, born somewhere near Avignon, though there's a strong chance that's fiction written later by a gossiping biographer. She was passed between noble families like a parcel wrapped in silk, a girl with no fortune but excellent posture. Her mother died young. Her father squandered what little wealth remained on imported wine and musical tutors for sons who couldn't hold a note. Constance was the quiet one, the polite one, the one who knew better than to take up space in a room. You imagine her at 13, sitting through lessons in deportment, how to enter a salon without being noticed, how to appear intelligent without ever interrupting, how to look beautiful without looking available. A sort of slow-motion disguise that high society excelled at. There's a diary entry from a governess who taught her French pronunciation. The girl has a strange way of looking through mirrors as if she expects to find someone else on the other side. The governess, later dismissed for overly fanciful language, may have noticed something others ignored. A habit, perhaps, of losing herself mid-reflection. By 16, Constance had been renamed twice. First Clarice, when adopted by a distant aunt who thought it sounded more fashionable, then Anne-Marie when introduced at court because, apparently, Constance sounded too pious. Each new name came with new dresses, new jewellery, new instructions for smiling. And somewhere under all those layers the real girl must have started to disappear. You picture her walking down the polished corridors of a borrowed house, watching maids carry mirrors draped in cloth because superstition said too many reflections made a woman vain. But what if, for her, vanity was never the problem? What if she feared reflections for another reason entirely? Historians still argue whether the tale of her many names is literal or symbolic, a metaphor for women of her class, perhaps, who existed as echoes of the men they married. But there's something unsettling about the sheer paperwork of her identity. Dozens of letters signed in half a dozen variations, like she couldn't quite remember who she was supposed to be that season. By her early 20s, Constance was known at court as the girl with too many names. That's not a metaphor. It's written on an invitation to a masquerade ball held by the Duchess of Devonshire. Dinner and dancing, and perhaps the presence of that young lady who cannot decide what she is called this week. A cruel little joke, but perhaps not entirely undeserved in a society built on facades. She had already learned the art of invisible performance, speaking in gentle, looping sentences that made no demands, smiling as if she were always half dreaming. A perfect woman for a portrait, really. One minor scandal followed her during those years. A rumour about a mirror at the Château de Miraval that cracked cleanly down the middle while she was looking into it. The servants claimed it was a sign of bad luck. But when asked, Constance supposedly said something that sent a shiver through them all. It wasn't the mirror that broke. It was the girl inside it. A dramatic line, sure. Maybe apocryphal, or maybe not. There's an odd report in a French local chronicle about a young noblewoman of unusual countenance who fainted during a painter's sitting because the image upon the canvas no longer resembled her. This might have been her. It fits the time, the location, even the temperament. By 24, she'd become a quiet curiosity at salons, praised for her beauty, but pitied for her lack of sparkle. Too thoughtful, some said. Too self-aware, said others. One wit described her as a ghost rehearsing for a life she hasn't yet lived. And then came the proposal. The Duke of Selgrave was a widower twice over, a man whose money was so old it had started to fossilise. His estates stretched across both England and the continent, his temper across most of the known emotional spectrum. He was, in short, an excellent match for anyone who valued titles more than peace of mind. Constance accepted, or was persuaded to. Depending on which historian you ask, it was either a calculated choice for security or an act of quiet resignation. The letters she left behind suggest neither. They suggest exhaustion. In one of them, written in cramped ink before the engagement was announced, she says, "I no longer recognize the handwriting in my own hand. It seems someone else has been practicing as me." That single line has driven scholars mad for centuries. Was it poetic melancholy, early symptoms of dissociation, or a veiled reference to something stranger, something that would later bloom into legend? When she arrived in London as the new Duchess, she was greeted with polite applause and a mild curiosity reserved for women too quiet to gossip about. The newspapers noted her ethereal composure and delicate reserve. But behind that, she began to accumulate small rumours like lint, that she never stood in direct sunlight, that her maid was instructed to remove all reflective surfaces from her chambers, that she spoke to her own portrait sketches as though apologising. People laughed, of course. The upper classes always do when someone starts to unravel quietly. There's a surviving letter from one of her ladies-in-waiting that says, Sometimes she stares at her own hands as though they belong to another. Once she asked if her pulse could be painted, as if the body were not enough proof of living. Quirky, yes. Frightening, maybe, but remember, this was the age of powdered faces and painted masks. Maybe she simply understood better than anyone that an image could swallow you whole. And that brings you back to this gallery, this portrait, because somewhere between the girl with too many names and the Duchess who sat for Sebastian Lawn, something crucial happened. Something that made her decide that the next image drawn of her would not merely represent her. It would contain her. Or maybe it already had. For now, though, the story is still gentle. Powdered halls, quiet laughter, and a woman watching herself fade one polite curtsy at a time. The storm hasn't begun yet. But you can almost hear the brush being dipped into oil, waiting. You find yourself drifting down a corridor that smells faintly of rosewater and something metallic beneath it, the scent of gilded ambition. It's the late 1760s and the house of Selgrave is alive with murmurs and rustling skirts. Every chandelier seems to hum with candlelight. Every face glows with the kind of powdered confidence that can only exist when everyone's pretending to like one another. The Duchess, your Duchess now, stands at the edge of a ballroom, her back straight, her lips forming that well-practiced half-smile that means both I'm listening and I'd rather be anywhere else. Around her, courtiers orbit like bees, too exhausted to sting. This is the era of powdered dreams and political games, the kind of world where gossip travels faster than ink dries, and marriage proposals are less about love and more about property management. You glide among the guests unnoticed, listening to fragments of polite cruelty disguised as compliments. She's rather plain, isn't she? Beautiful, yes, but plain about it. Oh, I heard she refuses mirrors now. Superstitious little thing. Perhaps she's just tired of seeing herself outshine her husband. Laughter, fans flutter, lace trembles. You can imagine Constance, or whatever name she's using this season, letting those barbs pass through her like silk through water. She's too clever to react, too observant to belong. She sips her watered wine and gazes up at a painting of some long-dead ancestor whose armour shines brighter than his eyes ever did. In a world ruled by appearances, she has perfected the art of invisibility. You can almost hear her thoughts, quiet but sharp. If I am what they see, then what happens when I stop letting them see me? It's the kind of thought that would have been dangerous in any century, but especially then, when women's bodies were decorative, their expressions ornamental, and their silences expected. One night, the Duke decides it's time for a portrait. Every noble family needed one, a declaration of taste and wealth and eternal poise. Posterity must have your likeness, he says, and she nods, already knowing she'll have no say in it. Historians still argue whether he commissioned it as a gesture of affection or control. Either way, it meant inviting a stranger into their home, a painter whose job it would be to interpret her soul in oils, and whose success would depend entirely on how much of herself she was willing to give. The artist's name was Sebastian Lawn. At that time, he was already famous, the darling of both London salons and Paris ateliers. His portraits had the unnerving quality of motion, as if his subjects were about to breathe or blink. Some critics called it genius, others found it unsettling. One patron reportedly covered his own portrait with a cloth because he couldn't stand the feeling of being watched by himself, so of course the Duke hired him immediately. The first sitting took place on a Tuesday morning in the East Parlour, where the light was clean and merciless. You can picture it. The crackle of the fire, the squeak of the easel, the faint rhythm of brushes tapping against glass jars. Constance sits perfectly still, her spine straight, her chin lifted just enough to look noble but not arrogant. Sebastian circles her like a hawk. He doesn't speak much at first. His assistants adjust drapes and polish lenses while he studies her, really studies her, as though memorizing every hesitation. Then he says something that freezes the air. Most people want to be seen. You seem to want to be forgotten. She doesn't answer. Maybe she doesn't need to. Later, he'll write in his journal that she had the face of a woman who listens to her own reflection before answering. From that moment on, their sessions are strange dances of silence. He paints, she endures, and the room fills with attention no one dares name. He tells her stories of other women he's painted. Duchesses, actresses, the occasional mistress disguised as myth. She responds with short, polite phrases, though her eyes never quite stay in one place. There's a rumour, unverified of course, that he once asked her to remove her gloves and she refused. When pressed, she said, "Some parts of us are not meant to be remembered." You wonder what he saw in that refusal. Challenge, mystery, or fear? Weeks pass. The portrait takes shape, layer after layer of pigment like veils of time itself. He paints her in a gown of soft grey-blue satin, a colour said to make the skin look luminous. Behind her, a heavy curtain, half-drawn, suggesting secrets too elegant to mention aloud, yet every time he tries to capture her eyes, something goes wrong. Too bright, too distant, too knowing. "They won't stay," he mutters once, unaware she can hear him. When he finally steps back from the easel, the likeness is near perfect. And yet, not. Something's missing. Something essential. He paints and repaints her face until even his assistants begin to worry. One night, an apprentice claims he saw her reflection in the wet paint, though she hadn't yet entered the room. Another insists that when he turned his back, the brush moved on its own. Sebastian dismisses them both, though his hands begin to tremble. He starts working later and later, even when the Duchess isn't there, muttering about getting the gaze right. At a dinner party, the Duke brags that his wife's portrait will outshine all others. The Duchess smiles politely, then asks, "And what if it outlives us instead?" Laughter again, but not from her. A fringe tidbit buried in one of Sebastian's letters mentions a superstition among painters of the era that too much focus on the eyes could invite the sitter's soul to remain within the canvas. Most dismissed it as workshop folklore, yet Sebastian began wearing a silver charm around his neck for protection against unfinished spirits. Whether he was joking or not, we'll never know. By now, the Duchess's reputation at court has shifted. People call her hauntingly beautiful Ndiggy, a compliment that always sounds like a mild accusation. A few whisper that she's not aging, others claim she's paler, thinner, as though she's been sitting too long under candlelight. But what's a little gossip compared to immortality? Every day the painting grows more vivid, while she, the real woman, grows fainter. She laughs less, eats less. One maid swears she saw the Duchess pause before a mirror and ask softly, "Which one of us is pretending now?" If she ever noticed that the painting's smile no longer matched her own, she didn't say. Historians debate endlessly whether she and Sebastian shared any forbidden intimacy. Most say no. The Duke's temper would have made that suicidal. But others argue something deeper happened, a kind of spiritual affair, an artist and his subject caught in a quiet conspiracy to capture or escape reality. Whatever the truth, by the end of that winter, the portrait was nearly done. Except for one small, impossible problem. Every morning the eyes were slightly different, sometimes softer, sometimes colder, once unmistakably frightened. Sebastian began to paint faster, almost frantically, as if trying to pin something down before it could move again. And the Duchess? She just watched, calm, unreadable, as though she already knew what he didn't yet dare admit. That once a part of you starts to live inside a painting, the rest of you can't help but fade. The wedding portraits of the period all look the same: lace, ribbons, vague smiles, and expressions of terminal politeness, but hers is different. You can feel that difference immediately, like stepping into a draft that no one else notices. By now it's early spring, 1769. The air inside the Selgrave estate is heavy with the scent of lilies and oil paint. The Duke's household hums with servants preparing for the grand unveiling of his wife's portrait, though the Duke himself hasn't seen it yet. He's been away in London, arguing about tariffs and pretending to be important. The Duchess doesn't seem to mind. She's spent nearly every afternoon in the painter's studio, watching herself materialize layer by layer under Sebastian Lawn's increasingly nervous brush. You can almost see her sitting there, back straight, hands folded, gaze slightly averted. The perfect Duchess, the perfect muse. Except this isn't a love story. It's a transaction, a marriage signed in gilt and ink. When the Duke finally returns, the contrast between them couldn't be sharper. He's florid, loud, smelling faintly of tobacco and entitlement. She's translucent, quiet, as if her mind has been elsewhere for weeks. Maybe it has. He strides into the parlour, demands to see the progress. Sebastian hesitates, dabbing a final highlight on the pearl earring before turning the canvas toward its patron. The room stills. For a moment no one breathes. Then the Duke exhales a small, uncertain laugh. She looks. He squints. Almost real. The Duchess tilts her head, eyes narrowing. Almost. The word catches somewhere deep inside her. He circles the portrait once, nodding at the brushwork, muttering about tone and shadow, as if he knows what those words mean. Sebastian stands perfectly still, his knuckles white around the palette knife. Finally, the Duke claps him on the shoulder. Good work. Frame it in gold, the larger kind. Then, without looking at his wife, he adds, perhaps now she'll remember how fortunate she is. If you ever needed proof that ego was a combustible material, you just found it. Later that night, a dinner is held in the artist's honour. The Duchess attends, though her expression suggests she's watching from somewhere else entirely. Candlelight flutters along the silver cutlery, catching the tremor of her hands as she raises her glass. The guests toast art, beauty, legacy. She says nothing, but every so often her gaze drifts toward the far end of the room where the portrait now hangs, unfinished, yet already unsettling. There's something wrong with it. Even in the dim light, you can tell. Her painted eyes don't meet the viewers directly. They seem to focus slightly over one's shoulder toward a point no one can see. And her mouth, yes, her mouth, seems caught between breath and speech. Historians still argue whether this was intentional, a trick of composition, or a psychological accident. Sebastian, in his journals, described it as a face that keeps changing its mind. A servant girl later confessed that she once found the Duchess standing before the portrait long after midnight, whispering to it softly, "Do you know who you are?" By the time the Duke retires to bed that evening, the household feels tense, restless. Even the chandeliers seem to hum too loudly. Sebastian lingers in the hallway after the guests leave. The Duchess approaches him, her steps soundless on the marble. She studies the portrait again, her own likeness watching her from the canvas, and then says very quietly, "It's not finished." He stammers something about final touches, drying times, layers of glaze, but she shakes her head. "No," she says, "it's not me yet." There's no arrogance in her tone, only a strange sadness. "You've painted what everyone sees," she continues, "but that isn't what remains." Sebastian, ever the idealist, replies, "Then tell me what remains." Her answer is almost a whisper. That depends on who's looking. And with that, she leaves him there, bewildered, holding his palette like a shield. You have to imagine his state of mind that night. Brilliant, superstitious, and now slightly afraid. He begins repainting portions of the portrait without her consent, adds shadows that weren't there before, softens her jawline, deepens her gaze. It's as if he's chasing something that moves every time he blinks. The next day, he notices something new. Her reflection no longer matches her image in the painting. When she enters the room, the portrait's face appears marginally older, paler, as though time inside the canvas flows differently. A fringe tidbit from an art historian notes that painters of the era sometimes used lead white mixed with crushed bone for their skin tones. If that's true, then technically a part of her portrait was made from the dead. How's that for poetic immortality? The Duke, of course, notices none of this. He's too busy planning a hunting trip. He orders the portrait completed by Easter to be unveiled during a garden fete. But when the day arrives, the Duchess insists on postponing. The weather, she says, isn't right for sunlight on varnish. The Duke laughs and lets her have her way. Why argue over something as trivial as superstition? Yet the staff start whispering. They claim the Duchess visits the studio alone, sometimes staying there for hours, emerging pale and trembling. Once, a maid finds her fingertips smudged with pigment, as if she's been touching her painted twin. Sebastian's health begins to decline. He's feverish, sleep-deprived, muttering that she's slipping through. And still the Duke sees nothing. Historians have long debated whether the Duchess's growing obsession with her image was psychological, a woman crushed by expectation, or mystical, something stranger at play. One camp insists she suffered from mirror anxiety, a known but rarely documented phenomenon in the 18th century. The other points to the oddities in Sebastian's final works, portraits whose subjects appear subtly distorted, as though resisting the brush. Whichever side you take, the result is the same. The portrait begins to feel alive, and the Duchess begins to feel less so. Her appetite dwindles. She laughs once during a concert, and the sound surprises her. She starts writing letters she never sends, drafts addressed to no one, signed in 3 different names. By the time the Duke notices, it's too late. The house is already full of whispers. The servants cross themselves when they walk past the studio. And somewhere behind the locked door, the portrait of the Duchess stares out from its frame, eyes half closed, as though dreaming of a way to leave. You stand there too, centuries later, feeling that same pull, that quiet gravity of something unfinished. And if you listen closely enough, beneath the hum of time and varnish, you might just hear her voice. It's not finished. You're back in that studio again, not as a guest, not even as an observer, but as someone who feels the weight of the air thick with turpentine and candle smoke. Every inch of the place smells like effort, paint, sweat, patience. On the easel stands the portrait, nearly complete now, and the woman within it seems both luminous and wrong. The painter, Sebastian Lawn, wipes his palms against his apron as if he could steady himself by touch alone. His brush trembles in his hand. The Duchess, your Duchess, sits a few feet away, motionless. The morning light slices across the room in dusty beams, catching the gold threads on her gown. He tries to speak casually. "Just a few last details, Your Grace, the hands perhaps and the folds of the fabric." But she interrupts him softly. "You've painted too much already." He blinks, confused. "Too much?" She turns her gaze to the canvas where her own eyes look back at her, unblinking, oddly sentient. "There's something in there now that shouldn't be," she says. Her voice is calm, but her reflection in the mirror behind them seems delayed, a fraction of a second too slow, as if deciding whether to echo her at all. Sebastian forces a smile. "You mean you don't like it?" "I mean," she says, "it's starting to breathe." He laughs nervously, the way you do when someone tells you a ghost story that lands a little too close to home. He insists it's a trick of the light. That fresh oil paint can seem alive when wet. She doesn't answer. Her gaze stays fixed on the portrait. That evening, he writes in his diary, "Her likeness changes when I'm not looking. The corners of her mouth move slightly upward, then downward, depending on the light. I asked my apprentices if they noticed. They said no, but I saw one of them cross himself." Historians still argue whether Sebastian's journals are genuine or forged by later romantics, but the handwriting matches and the tone is consistent. The entries grow more desperate, more poetic, and more frightened. He begins working only by candlelight, claims daylight distorts her features. The servants whisper that he's painting shadows onto shadows, that he's begun murmuring to the canvas under his breath. One fringe rumour, the kind you only find in the footnotes of obscure art history books, claims that he used a drop of her blood mixed with pigment to achieve the perfect blush on her cheek. There's no proof, of course, but the reddish undertone is still there, centuries later, stubborn and strange. You picture it, the tiny nick on her fingertip, the way she might have smiled politely as he dabbed it away. For authenticity, he could have said, "To make you real." She'd have nodded, quietly amused. "You think I want to be real?" The portrait sessions stretch into night after night. The Duke rarely appears. When he does, he's impatient. He tells the painter to stop chasing ghosts and finish the damn thing. But Sebastian can't stop. Every time he thinks he's completed her eyes, they betray him. They follow him around the room. He begins to feel watched, even when he turns the canvas to face the wall. There's an incident one evening, small but memorable. The Duchess arrives for a final sitting, but when she takes her place, Sebastian gasps. Her skin seems paler than usual. He swears her pupils look slightly clouded, as if she's spent too long underwater. "You've been ill?" he asks. "No," she says. "I've been elsewhere." He doesn't ask where. Instead, he paints faster, brush after brush, layer after layer, his strokes quick, feverish. He's no longer painting her so much as chasing her. You can imagine it. The sound of bristles scratching against canvas, his breath short, her expression patient. Every so often she asks strange questions. What happens to people in paintings when the painter dies? Do they wait for someone else to finish them? Can a likeness forget who it's supposed to be? Sebastian tries to laugh them off. But one night, she catches him studying her reflection in the window and says, "You're not painting me, you're painting the part that wants to leave." That sentence will echo in his head for weeks. Eventually, the Duke demands to see progress. Sebastian refuses. He says it's not ready. The Duchess sides with him, oddly protective now. She says, "He's not finished learning what he's painting." At this point, gossip in the household reaches its peak. Servants say the Duchess is under a spell. Others whisper that she's found religion in the strangest form, worshipping her own reflection. A few even claim to have heard two voices speaking in the studio late at night. One human, one coming from the painting itself. If that sounds absurd, remember that this is the same era when learned men debated whether mirrors could capture the essence of a soul. Enlightenment science had barely caught its breath. People still believed portraits could reveal more than likeness. that they could record temperament, mood, even moral decay. So when Sebastian begins to fall ill, sleepless, pale, muttering to himself, the rumour spreads that he's been claimed by his creation. One of his letters, written but never sent, reads, "There is no longer a difference between her sitting before me and the image upon the canvas. I think one watches while the other pretends to sleep." By now the Duchess has stopped attending social gatherings entirely. She spends hours alone in that studio, sometimes in silence, sometimes humming an unrecognizable tune. The maids say the painter's tools rearrange themselves overnight. And yet, and this is the strange part, no one dares move or cover the painting. The Duke forbids it. He insists the portrait will be unveiled in grand ceremony once the artist recovers his health. But Sebastian doesn't recover. His fever worsens. He claims she's visiting him in dreams, standing at the foot of his bed, eyes open but unblinking, whispering, "You almost got it right." A week later, his assistants find him collapsed on the studio floor, surrounded by brushes and broken jars. The portrait stands untouched, except for one new detail, a faint, perfect thumbprint just under her collarbone. The Duke declares the painting complete. The Duchess, however, says nothing at all. She stands before the canvas, studying it as though waiting for her reflection to blink first. And you, standing there centuries later, can almost feel the silence she left behind, a silence so deep it hums. The kind of silence that only happens when something in the room is listening back. The eyes are the first thing you notice, again. Not because they're larger than life or jewel bright, but because they move like someone checking the weather, casually, constantly, and with a hint of impatience. You approach the canvas and feel that peculiar, stomach-tickling sensation of being evaluated. It's not rude, it's just terribly accurate, like a tax inspector who also happens to be photogenic. Sebastian mutters in the corner of his studio while you watch him work. He's taken to pacing, then sitting, then pacing again, as if exercise might coax stability out of pigment. "They won't behave," he says to no one in particular, scraping a brush against a rag until the room sounds like a small, polite rain. "They look away, they look back, they look at things that aren't there." You want to roll your eyes because artists exaggerate for effect. They always have. Fun historical fact. By the mid-18th century, portraiture was the aristocracy's favourite way to advertise status. Entire careers were made painting collars and convincing hair to look intentional. But you don't roll them because something about his tone wedges your own grin halfway open. There's worry in it. Genuine, old-fashioned worry that doesn't come with a polite condolence card. The apprentices call it the wandering gaze, as if it were an eccentric habit the portrait picked up at university. One apprentice insists the eyes tilt toward anyone who carries grief. Another says they favour those who've never loved properly. A third claims they simply look toward sunlight. You can imagine workshop debates. Should a painting favour the melancholic or the well-lit? The answer, apparently, is both. There's a small practical experiment sewn into the gossip of the house. Someone, likely the butler or perhaps a bored footman with too much time and a fondness for proving people wrong, placed a pewter spoon under the frame and watched to see where the eyes turned. The spoon was, predictably, unimpressed. The painting's gaze brushed past it like a socialite, glimpsing the hors d'oeuvre table and deciding it wasn't canapé enough. Fringe people, however, claimed the eyes tracked the spoon with jealous intensity for a full minute before deciding it was beneath them. You can file that under things people tell at parties when they want attention. Sebastian grows increasingly convinced there's a spirit involved. He starts talking about portraits that borrow too much and, likenesses that catch the wrong end of a person. He threads superstitious trinkets through his hair and pins a small charm to the easel, a ridiculous silver thing that looks like a button with more opinions than metal. Protection, he tells anyone who asks. Mostly, he tells it to himself. You watch him one afternoon as he works on the left eye, and it's eerie how careful he is, the way a man might coax a hyperactive child into a nap. He leans so close that his breath fogs the varnish. He paints an iris, steps back, frowns, and then paints it again in a slightly smaller circle as if the eye were shrinking from embarrassment. The apprentice watches with the mournful fascination of someone watching a clock that may or may not be wound correctly. Historians still argue whether these changes were deliberate techniques, part of Lorne's so-called living portrait approach, or something that happened after the paint dried. Some critics in later centuries claimed he used a series of delicate glazes to produce optical depth, and that those very layers refract light differently as varnish ages. Others whisper that the canvas was altered in the dead of night by hands that didn't belong to the painter. Either way, the effect is the same. The gaze refuses to settle, and everyone inside the house begins to feel like a suspect in a very dull, aristocratic mystery. At tea, people prod at the subject delicately, like offering a napkin to a guest who might cry. Surely it's just technique, says one relative brightly, as if optimism could function as a conservator. Artists always get sentimental, says another, flipping a glove. They use the word haunting with a kind of civic pride, as though living with the supernatural were an accessory like a brooch or a bad son-in-law. You, however, are less comfortable claiming accessories for the uncanny. Standing close to the canvas, you can feel a draft that isn't in the room's schedule, a little chilly pocket that traces the line between her cheek and the painted air. The painting's pupils dilate for a slow breath and then narrow, as if measuring you for fit. It's flattering and vaguely insulting at the same time. One late night, a maid reports seeing those eyes follow a fly around the studio before the insect finally collapses in the candle flame. She tells the story with a gasp and the exact cadence of someone who has rehearsed shock for years. The household laughter that follows is nervous and thin, the kind that tries to hold itself together with etiquette and stale cake. But servants tell each other different truths than their employers. In the servants' tiny world of stairs and storage, they begin to call the portrait her, as if it earns gender through attention alone. Sebastian's assistants begin to keep small logs, ridiculous, neat little books where they write down the gaze's behavior, like naturalists cataloguing a rare bird. 10th of March, glanced left after mop incident. 14th of March, looked toward the window during thunder. You can't help but appreciate the absurdity of it. If you ever needed proof that humans will quantify anything, here it is, in black ink and smudged charcoal. There's something comforting in it, like a checklist against chaos. Also, it makes for excellent gossip later when diaries are discovered and scholars smile indulgently. On a more personal note, you observe, because you are an excellent observer now, aren't you? That the eyes seem to prefer certain visitors. Children get popped off the canvas like corks. Adults are scanned like creditors. And the elderly are looked at with a patient, almost smug compassion. The painter's logs note the phenomenon with the clinical detachment of people who have stopped being startled by doors that open themselves. It makes you think about how people behave when they know they're being seen, and how much energy we waste not being what other people expect. There's a joke tucked in there somewhere about aristocrats pretending not to notice they're being judged by a painting. Your brain writes it and then politely files it under wry observations. One night, Sebastian wakes from a dream sweating and declares aloud that she whispered his name. His voice leaves a puddle of terrified sincerity on the studio floor. The apprentices stare at him in a manner that is both consoling and mildly entertained, a posture that humans within hierarchies are excellent at adopting. They try to explain it away: fever, exhaustion, the heat of oil lamps. But even the most rational apprentice pauses when he passes the frame and feels a prickling on the back of his neck, the physiological equivalent of being politely asked to leave. The Duke, predictably, treats it like a furniture problem. "Frame it properly," he suggests once, as if the right ornamentation could fix spiritual misbehavior. He visits the studio once, stands before the portrait, and blusters some compliment about posture. He is the sort of man who considers emotion a draft hazard and deals with it accordingly. It's as effective as a nap after a duel. Meanwhile, the servants begin to whisper another kind of rumour, that the portrait doesn't just glance, it recognizes. People who've lived whole lives pretending to be different find in that gaze an unnervingly accurate inventory of what they've hidden. It's uncomfortable, like walking into a room where the furniture remembers your childhood. You laugh because what else are you going to do? Humour is the human refuge. Another joke, very small, very polite, about hiring a portrait therapist drifts across the room and gets stuck halfway out of the mouth like a poorly tied ribbon. When restorers in later centuries peel back varnish and underpainting, they find traces of stenciled corrections around the eyes and notes in the margins in Lorne's cramped hand. Too vacant. Not shy enough. Too accusing. You read those notes and your chest tightens at the idea of someone auditioning not for a role, but for existence. It's the kind of thought that makes you want to call your reflection friendlier names. By the time the unveiling approaches, the household is split between those who worship the painting for its beauty and those who avoid the room to keep their nerves intact. You stand like many others have stood before you, curious, skeptical, and secretly thrilled. The eyes watch the crowd. They do not behave. They decide who is interesting and who is merely background. For a portrait, that's pretty judgmental work. But then portraits have always been rude in their own refined way. And as you move away, the eyes settle on you for a long, conspiratorial second. They don't blink. They don't have to. You carry that look with you, a private ticket to the next chapter of her life. One where the idea of vanishing from a painting becomes less metaphor and more option. It begins, as many unsettling things do, with something slightly absurd. A mirror, full-length, silver-backed, expensive, refuses to agree with the portrait. You might think that's poetic exaggeration. But no, that's how the servants describe it in their frightened little letters, written decades later when they were old enough to laugh about it. "Wouldn't agree," they said, as though the mirror and the painting had argued about scheduling. But the fact remains, the Duchess's reflection and her likeness in oil no longer matched. In the portrait, she looked pale, soft, calm, that faint half-smile still curving the corners of her lips like she was holding in a secret. But when she stood before a mirror, the woman looking back was thinner, her smile gone entirely, her eyes, God help them, empty. At first, everyone blamed lighting, then stress, then whatever delicate 18th century term existed for nerves. But it kept happening. One morning, her lady's maid, Eloise, swore the Duchess's reflection didn't move when she did. The real woman tilted her head left, the mirror tilted right, just for a second. Then everything caught up, like the reflection had been daydreaming. Eloise fainted, of course. Because that's what good servants do when reality becomes inconvenient. When the Duke heard, he forbade mirrors in the Duchess's chambers entirely. Not because he believed the story, but because it was embarrassing. Ghost rumours were for poor people. The Duchess didn't protest. She simply smiled, that tiny, tired smile that had already started to fade from her real face, and said, "Yes, it's better that way." After that, the house changed. The mirrors were draped one by one. The great gilt frame at the end of the hallway, the ornate oval one above the grand staircase, all covered in linen like mourners. Only the portrait remained exposed, glowing faintly under candlelight, the sole reflective thing left in the house. And that's when the servants began whispering that it was hungry. Now, hungry portraits weren't unheard of in folklore. Artists used to warn apprentices not to stare too long into unfinished eyes. Said it drew something out of you. Silly talk, yes, but sometimes silly talk lingers for a reason. Because soon after the mirrors were covered, things began to shift inside the painting. It started small. The Duchess's pearl necklace seemed to sit a little higher one day, as though her painted throat had grown slimmer. Then a faint line appeared near her collarbone, like a shadow that didn't belong to anything. Sebastian Lorne, the painter, was dead by then, collapsed in fever, whispering about a soul trapped in reflection. But his apprentices were still around, finishing minor commissions for the Duke. One of them, a timid boy named Alfred, claimed he saw her eyes change colour while he dusted the frame. "Blue one day, grey the next," he told the housekeeper. "Like the sea when it's deciding whether to drown you." The housekeeper smacked him for blasphemy and told him to mind his work. But Alfred wasn't lying, because a week later, when the Duke hosted a small gathering, one guest, a viscount with a notorious fondness for scandal, approached the portrait mid-conversation and froze. "She's looking at me," he said aloud, half laughing. "No, really looking." The laughter around him died awkwardly. Someone said, "That's the idea, my lord." But the Viscount only stared harder. "No, she knows me." Now this was quite the accusation for a painting, and worse for the Duchess, who was standing across the room, very much alive, trying to look amused. Everyone followed the Viscount's gaze, and for the briefest, most uncomfortably silent second, they saw it too. The eyes in the painting had shifted, just slightly, but unmistakably. Not toward the Duke, not toward the room in general, straight toward the Viscount. A collective intake of breath followed, the polite kind where no one wants to be the first to scream. Then the Duke laughed loudly, theatrically. "Parlour tricks," he said, waving a hand. "Bad varnish and bad imagination." But the Duchess didn't laugh. She excused herself early that night, and when Eloise came to undress her, she found the Duchess standing before her dressing mirror, the one she had secretly left uncovered. She was staring into it with a look of mild confusion. "What is it, Your Grace?" the maid asked, too softly. The Duchess smiled faintly. "I was just wondering," she said, "which one of us is the copy?" And then she turned away and asked Eloise to drape the mirror for good. The next morning she ordered that the portrait room be locked. No servants allowed, no visitors, not even the Duke. When pressed for a reason, she said, "Because it listens." Historians still argue whether this phase marked the beginning of her so-called decline, the point where grief, isolation, and superstition merged into paranoia. Others claim she wasn't declining at all. She was escaping. You can almost picture her pacing the long corridors at night, lit only by candlelight, the flame trembling as she passes draped mirrors and shuttered windows. The house sighs with her steps. Somewhere behind one of those doors, her likeness waits, painted and patient, eyes ready to follow. And on certain nights, or so one particularly chatty servant later swore, the faintest whisper could be heard through the locked door of the portrait room. A woman's voice, low and tired. "Don't look at me." That's the kind of warning no one ever obeys. You can almost smell it, the stale sweetness of linseed oil, the dusty velvet curtains that haven't been drawn back in years. The portrait studio has become a room that breathes its own air, heavy and motionless. The Duchess of Selgrave has forbidden anyone to enter after dusk. Yet servants whisper that they hear things inside. Brushes clinking against glass. The gentle swish of skirts, a faint humming that stops whenever anyone listens too hard. They say the Duchess's reflection walks there now. It begins as gossip, of course, because gossip is what keeps grand houses from rotting too quickly. The cook's boy swears he saw a pale woman glide past the cracked studio door, though the Duchess was dining downstairs at the time. A footman insists he heard soft footsteps pacing in rhythm with her own, like an echo from inside the walls. No one wants to believe it, but belief becomes a kind of contagion. Eloise, the maid, is the first to confess she's seen the Duchess twice in the same evening, once crossing the hall to the portrait room, and again peering down from an upstairs window while the first Duchess was still below. A trick of light, the housekeeper says, but her voice shakes just enough to invite another story instead of ending it. And the stories multiply. Late one night, 2 apprentices of Sebastian Lorne, young men still kept on retainer to maintain the family's gallery, report seeing something move behind the draped curtains. They swear they heard whispers. Not words, exactly, but the rhythm of speech. One claims he saw a hand, pale and shimmering, press against the inside of the glass cabinet that houses the painter's old palettes. The Duke dismisses them both the next morning and forbids anyone from mentioning it again. "No more hysterics," he says. "This house has a reputation." But the Duchess only smiles faintly at breakfast. "Reputation," she murmurs, "is just another kind of portrait, isn't it?" That's when people begin noticing her eyes. They've grown distant, slightly unfocused, as though she's watching 2 worlds at once. When she speaks, there's often a pause before her words arrive, as if she's listening to an echo only she can hear. Historians still argue whether this marks the beginning of her rumoured second self, an early case of what modern psychologists would call dissociation, or whether it was something far less explainable. Either way, those who met her during that year described the same eerie impression. She seemed to move slightly out of sync with herself. At dinner, she would turn her head to listen before anyone spoke. In conversation, her sentences trailed off mid-air, as if she were translating between unseen versions of the same thought. By now, even the Duke grows uneasy. He sends for priests, then for physicians, then, predictably, for an exorcist, though he disguises the visit as a consultation on spiritual melancholy. The holy man lasts all of 5 minutes in the portrait room before emerging pale and muttering about mirrors where none should be. One quirky tidbit appears in his written account years later. He describes standing before the canvas and seeing not the Duchess as painted, but his own reflection staring back, dressed in her gown, her pearls, her expression. "A test of the devil," he writes, or perhaps the more merciful confusion of light. After that, no one else enters the room, except her. Each night, when the household sleeps, she slips through the corridor barefoot, candle in hand. The flame shivers as she opens the door. The servants hear the latch click, the soft scrape of her chair, the silence that follows. No one knows what she does in there. One rumour says she speaks to the portrait, asking it questions in French, the language of her childhood. Another claims she brings sheets of paper and sketches, shapes that vanish by morning. But the most persistent story, the one whispered by generations of servants long after the Selgrave line has ended, is this, that sometimes she paints back. In the morning, the brush she left behind the night before has changed position. The candle stubs are shorter than she remembers. Once, the Duke bursts in unexpectedly and finds the portrait glossier than before, its eyes deeper, almost wet. He accuses her of tampering with his property. She only laughs and says, "Wouldn't it be wonderful if art could look after itself?" The Duke leaves, furious. That night, he orders the studio locked from the outside. The next morning, the lock is still in place, but the room smells faintly of turpentine, and a fresh brush lies on the table, damp with grey-blue paint. Scholars have since examined the portrait under every kind of light. Beneath the outermost layer, they found faint changes, tiny brush strokes that didn't match the painter's technique. The paint composition is identical to the original, down to the impurities in the oil, which suggests one impossible conclusion. The same hand returned centuries after it was painted, or else the painting changed itself. Historians still debate whether these alterations were due to humidity or human interference, but one passage from an old estate journal keeps reappearing in every analysis. It's dated exactly a month after the Duke ordered the room locked. Her Grace walks softer now, eats little, sleeps not at all, yet her likeness glows as though fresh. I think she spends her rest inside the paint. A poetic servant, surely. But sometimes servants notice things poets only guess at, because a week later, when a storm rolls across Selgrave, lightning cracks through the north gallery window. The force rattles every frame, except one. The portrait remains utterly still, untouched by wind or rain. And afterward, when the Duchess finally opens the door again, Eloise swears she hears 2 sets of footsteps leaving the room. Midnight in the Selgrave estate has a sound to it, a sort of sighing that lives between the walls, where the wind forgets which way to go. You've heard houses settle before, their timbers creaking like tired bones. But this isn't that. This sound breathes. It's the night of the secret sitting. By now the Duchess barely sleeps. The maids say she walks through the halls like a ghost rehearsing its entrance, candlelight following her like a servant too afraid to quit. Her hair is unpinned, her gown simple, her expression somewhere between exhaustion and defiance. And tonight she's decided something dangerous. She's sent word to the only person in the house who might understand. Sebastian Lorne's remaining apprentice, a boy of 20 with eyes too old for his face. His name, though the records argue over spelling, was Oliver. You imagine him trembling in the corridor, half asleep, holding a box of paints that smell faintly of rot and roses. He doesn't want to go in, but the Duchess herself opens the door and whispers, "Quickly." Inside, the air is thick with old candle smoke and turpentine. The portrait looms above them, aglow with its own kind of light. "I need one last sitting," she says. "Your Grace," he stammers, "the master's work is finished. It's—" "No," she cuts him off. "It isn't finished. It never was." There's something in her voice that doesn't belong entirely to her. He sets up the easel, more out of fear than duty. "Do you mean to, repaint?" She doesn't answer. Instead, she moves toward the painting and gestures for him to light another candle. "Do you know what happens?" she asks. "If a portrait takes too much from the living?" He shakes his head. It begins to crave what it borrowed. And with that, she reaches out. Her fingers hover just above the canvas, close enough that the candlelight licks the gold edge of her wedding ring. For a moment, nothing happens. Then under her hand the paint ripples, like breath beneath skin. Oliver gasps, dropping his brush. She doesn't even look at him. "Do you see?" she whispers. "It's still alive." He nods, terrified. She turns to him, her face serene. "You will help me, won't you? One last time." He hesitates. Then, because history always rewards obedience with horror, he says yes. What follows is one of those moments historians can't quite agree on. Some say she asked him to repaint her face entirely, to free her from herself. Others claim she made him destroy parts of the background, scraping away the dark drapery that framed her figure. But in Oliver's own account, discovered decades later among papers sold at auction, he describes something much stranger. She bade me stand behind her as she sat before the likeness. The light was dim and her breath came quick, as though she were dizzy. Then she said, "Now look at the two of us and tell me which one moves first." He swears he looked between her and the portrait and saw, impossibly, both figures blink. "I couldn't tell which one began," he wrote. "It was like the same motion mirrored through oil." Then she asked him a question that has haunted art historians ever since. "What happens," she whispered, "if the painted one decides she no longer wishes to stay still?" Oliver panicked. He begged her to stop, to let him fetch the Duke, the priest, anyone. But she smiled, that slow, terrible smile that makes beauty feel like a weapon. "No need," she said softly. "He won't understand. He only sees what flatters him." Then she reached out again, this time pressing her palm against her painted face. For a split second, the room filled with the sound of air being sucked inward, like the entire house gasping. The candle flames bent sharply toward the canvas, and then silence. When Oliver dared to look up, she had drawn her hand away. Her palm was smeared with paint. The portrait's cheek was faintly smudged, as though someone had touched the surface from inside. He fell to his knees, babbling apologies. She only looked at her hand, dazed. "It's warmer than it should be," she murmured, "almost beating." Later, she ordered him to leave. He refused at first, terrified of what she might do. She smiled again, distant, almost kind. "You've been very brave, but this part I must finish alone." He left the studio trembling, bolting the door behind him at her request. No one saw her until morning. When Eloise entered at dawn, she found the Duchess asleep at her desk, head resting beside an extinguished candle. The portrait stood untouched, or so it seemed. But the maid swore there was something different about the painted figure's eyes. "They look tired," she said later, "as if they'd been awake all night." The Duke dismissed it as nonsense, of course. But that very evening he noticed the faint smell of smoke coming from the studio. He ordered the servants to investigate. They found nothing, no fire, no damage. Only the faint trace of candle soot along the bottom of the portrait's frame, as though the painting itself had exhaled. Scholars who later examined Oliver's notes found one final chilling entry, written the day after the secret sitting. She said the painting sleeps during daylight now, and wakes when the moon is bright. She told me not to worry if I hear it moving. "It's only shifting its weight," she said. "It gets stiff, trapped like that." Historians still argue whether the young man was hallucinating, trying to absolve himself of guilt, or simply embellishing the truth to sell a better story. But if you stand in front of that portrait today, in its dim-lit gallery in Devonshire, you might notice what others have, that the Duchess's right hand, painted resting against her lap, is not quite still. Under the right light, it seems to hover, fingers slightly lifted as if waiting for permission to move again. And some nights, when the moon leans through the tall windows, just so, the guards swear they see two faint silhouettes reflected in the varnish, one sitting, one standing behind her. The illness begins like a rumour, quiet, slow, impossible to separate from fear. Sebastian Lorne, the painter who gave the Duchess her immortality, has not been seen in weeks. You imagine his house now, a modest London townhouse with curtains drawn tight and the air heavy with fever. The servants whisper that he talks in his sleep, calling her name, not his wife's, not the Duke's, but hers. The Duchess. The doctors say it's pneumonia. His apprentices say it's exhaustion. But if you ask the few friends he has left, they'd tell you something different. They'd tell you he's haunted. The fever came on days after the secret sitting. That night, he had woken suddenly in bed, gasping for air, claiming he could hear the Duchess humming from inside his studio. His wife, Margaret, thought it was a nightmare. But when she went to fetch water, she found the studio door ajar and the lamps still burning. The portrait wasn't there, at least not at first glance. The easel was empty. Brushes lay scattered on the floor like broken promises. And then when she turned, she saw it, the Duchess's face staring from the corner of the room, half hidden by shadow, the canvas propped against the wall, as if it had walked there itself. She screamed, naturally. He came running, delirious, muttering, "Don't move her, she'll get angry." He made her help carry the portrait back to its place, then sealed the door. That was the last time she saw him leave his bed without trembling. Now, weeks later, his fever has burned through reason. Margaret sits by his bedside, damp cloth in hand, watching him clutch the sheets as though trying to hold on to something invisible. He whispers phrases that make no sense to her, but will one day appear in the margins of his surviving sketchbooks. She's still inside. I painted the exit too small. She won't stay where I left her. The doctors prescribe leeches and opiates. The priests prescribe prayer. None of it helps. The fever deepens. His breathing slows. On his final night, Margaret claims she wakes to find him sitting upright, staring at something across the room. His eyes are wide, his lips cracked, but he's smiling, softly, almost peacefully. "Do you see her?" he whispers. Margaret, terrified, shakes her head. He sighs. She's gone. Finally gone. Then he falls back, eyes open, dead before she can reach for him. The candlelight trembles, and for a moment she swears the air smells of paint. She will bury him 2 days later, though not before writing to the Duke of Selgrave. Her letter is brief, brittle, and entirely sincere. "My husband's mind was undone by that portrait. He begged me to destroy it, but I could not. You should, though, for your sake and hers." The Duke never replies. Instead, he sends a messenger with payment for services rendered and orders the painting shipped back to the estate. When the crate arrives, the servants refuse to open it. The Duchess herself insists on unsealing it in private. Inside, the painting is untouched. No mould, no tears, no damage. Only one addition, a small handprint in faint red near the edge of the frame, as though someone reached out mid-delivery and tried to steady it. That night, the Duke hosts a dinner to distract from the tragedy. He toasts the triumph of art, as though his painter's death were merely an unfortunate invoice adjustment. The Duchess says nothing. Later, long after the guests have gone, she returns to the studio and lights a single candle. The flame dances across her painted twin, illuminating the features that seem both hers and not. "You look better," she says quietly. No one answers. But the shadows shift slightly around the eyes. You can almost feel the tension in the air, the weight of words unsaid, of truths too fragile for daylight. She lowers herself into the chair before the portrait, resting her hands on her lap. "He's gone," she whispers. "You can stop pretending." The silence hums like a held breath. Then faintly she hears it. A sigh, not from her own lips, but from the painted ones. The candle flickers, and for a heartbeat, the reflection in the varnish shows 2 women sitting there, one in flesh, one in pigment, mirroring each other perfectly. The Duchess laughs, softly, tiredly. "You win then," she says. "Stay if you must, I'm too tired to argue." Historians still argue whether this account, recorded later by the Duchess's maid Eloise, was ever real. Some say it's nothing but a servant's fever dream, a Gothic flourish to decorate an otherwise ordinary tragedy. Others, however, point to the strange detail Eloise included at the end of her letter. When her Grace rose to leave the room, her reflection in the glass cabinet did not rise with her. It sat a moment longer, smiling faintly, before fading back into the paint. The Duke, furious, orders the painting sealed behind a velvet curtain, out of sight and out of mind. But the staff still whisper. The lamps near the studio burn out faster than anywhere else. The curtains sometimes sway when no one's near them. And once, only once, Eloise swears she saw the Duchess's shadow pause beside the locked door, tilt its head, and whisper something she couldn't quite hear. Something that sounded like, "He's free now." Whether she meant the painter or herself, no one ever knew. The years after the painter's death become the quiet years. Quiet, but not peaceful. The Duchess of Selgrave, once a figure of fascination in London and Paris alike, begins to fade from public life. Invitations go unanswered. The grand salon she once attended in powdered grace carry on without her name among the guest lists. And in her place a new story begins to circulate, that she has fallen ill. Some say of grief, some of madness, others of vanity finally turned inward like a blade. In truth, she is not sick, not exactly. She is merely withdrawing. You can see it in your mind. The Selgrave estate wrapped in mist, curtains always drawn, servants moving in slippers to avoid sound. The Duchess walks its corridors less like an inhabitant than a memory still wandering. She eats little, sleeps less. Even her handwriting grows thin, spidery, as if her hand forgets how to connect words to meaning. When people ask after her, the Duke replies, with his usual blend of pride and irritation, "My wife has taken to quiet contemplation. I find it becoming. A word that means lovely, appropriate, and dying, all at once." Inside the house, the portrait is kept locked away in the north room, the old studio where light never quite reaches the corners. The Duke ordered the door sealed, the key given only to himself. He claims it's to preserve the painting from dust. But dust, like truth, has a way of seeping through locks. Historians still argue whether she ever went inside that room again. Some say she avoided it completely, that she feared what waited within. Others insist she visited nightly, her candlelight flickering behind the covered windows. There's no proof either way, only fragments of testimony from servants who stayed too long in the halls after dark. They describe hearing footsteps behind the locked door, slow, steady, pausing now and then as though to listen for its own echo. The housekeeper, Mrs. Crewe, wrote in her account years later, "It was not the pacing of one in distress. It was the pacing of one who keeps time to a rhythm none of us could hear." Sometimes the Duke would entertain guests, foreign dignitaries or minor royals, and inevitably one would ask about the portrait. He'd smile tightly. A private family matter. But the gossip persisted, and with every retelling the legend changed. Some said the Duchess had demanded the painting destroyed, others that she prayed before it nightly, hoping to reclaim her soul from the pigment. And then something subtle begins to shift. At first, it's the servants who notice. The Duchess's reflection grows faint, not absent, just hesitant. When she passes a window, the light catches her form half a second late. Mirrors show her at a slight angle as though she were walking in a different room entirely. Once, Eloise holds up a small-looking glass to pin a jewel at her mistress's throat, and swears she sees the Duchess's reflection blink after her. The maid drops the mirror. It shatters. The Duchess only says, "Good, I was tired of seeing double." You can't help but wonder what she meant by that. By this time, her laughter, once soft and melodic, becomes rare enough that it startles people when it happens. Even the Duke, returning from London after months away, finds her voice unfamiliar. "You sound like someone else," he tells her at dinner one night. She smiles faintly and replies, "Perhaps I am." He doesn't ask what she means. Men like him never do. Around this time, her social calendar collapses entirely. She refuses all invitations, returns all correspondence unopened. A poet dedicates a sonnet to her vanished grace, claiming her beauty withdrawn from daylight to converse with shadows. Another writes that she studies eternity behind locked doors. Both, ironically, are closer to the truth than they realize. Eloise remains her only confidant, though even she admits she no longer understands her mistress. The Duchess speaks less each week, but when she does, her words are peculiar. She asks whether a person can exist in two places at once, whether reflection or reality ages first, whether art grows tired of its subject. Sometimes Eloise catches her standing motionless before the draped mirror in her bedchamber, head tilted, as though listening. When asked what she hears, she answers, "The quieter one." It's around then that the staff begin to resign. One footman after another, the gardener, the cook, even the steward, who's been with the family for 20 years, leaves without explanation. Only Eloise remains loyal and trembling because someone must. The Duke, meanwhile, spends longer and longer in the city. Rumour has it he keeps company there. Warm, loud, very alive company. He returns home less each year, his letters clipped, perfunctory. When he does come back, he finds the Duchess paler than before, her hair streaked with silver, though she's barely past 30. At dinner, he remarks that she hardly seems real anymore. She replies, "I think that's the point." That same month, an art collector writes to the Duke requesting to borrow the portrait for exhibition in London. The Duke refuses, citing personal reasons. But in his ledger, a note appears beside the entry. Find a replacement. Same subject, less trouble. Less trouble. You imagine the Duchess reading those words. Perhaps she did, perhaps she didn't, and smiling her small, unbothered smile. Because what could he possibly replace her with now? At night, she begins writing again. Fragments mostly, lines of poetry that don't rhyme, thoughts about stillness and reflection. One surviving scrap reads, "There are women who live only once. There are others who live every time someone looks." No one knows where those pages end up. Some say they were hidden inside her writing desk. Others, that she burned them all one night while the house slept. But Eloise, loyal as always, keeps one thing. A note written on plain parchment, folded twice, found beneath the Duchess's pillow after her death. "When I vanish, remember, and the picture will still answer to my name." That's the trouble with quiet years. They're never truly quiet. They're just the part of the story where the ghosts learn how to listen. You receive the letter on a rain-soft morning, the sort of drizzle that cleans the air and makes even scandal feel damp and manageable. It arrives folded into a neat brown envelope, the handwriting small and furious, sealed with a smear of black wax, the colour of old grievances. The envelope bears no return address, only a name, Margaret Lorne, widow. She writes with the directness of someone who has seen the machinery behind a curtain and wants to point out the gears. "My husband begged me to destroy it," her first line reads, blunt and panicked as a kitchen knife. He told me the portrait paints itself at night, that it walks in his dreams and speaks in a voice that isn't human. He begged me, and I would not. Forgive me, it was a foolish mercy or a coward's kindness, I could not tell. You read it twice, because you like details and because small human confessions have the power to unsettle an entire house. Margaret describes Sebastian as a man once proud of his craft, someone who kept meticulous ledgers, who wrote obliging letters to patrons complaining only about the weather and the price of lapis lazuli. There's a mainstream fact tucked in there. Sebastian was, after all, recorded in the Royal Academy's minutes as having exhibited a portrait in 1765, a year that confirmed his reputation among certain London circles. So the man's credentials for obsessing about faces are historically unimpeachable. Her account shifts quickly from ledger to lunacy. She writes of his fevered nights when he wakes calling the Duchess's name. He would pace the studio muttering about a wrongness behind the varnish and wring his hands until Margaret feared they would bleed. One sentence gives you a tiny, grotesque laugh. He attempted to scrub the eyes with spirits, God forgive him. You imagine a man with paint under his nails trying to undo what paint had already done. Then she gives you the earnest, unadorned detail that changes everything. He told her, plainly, to take a hammer and break the canvas, destroy it, end the experiment. He said the canvas had teeth, she writes. Not literal, of course, foolish, childish, but he said it bit when he slept. He believed it fed on the living. Fringe, perhaps, but it nests with the rest of the story so snugly you have to consider it. You sit back in your chair and feel the room's hum. The letter continues. Margaret's refusal was practical. The patrons had paid handsomely. The Duke would sue. The painting was property, and property is stubbornly litigious. She tried to burn it once. She confesses in a paragraph that reads, like someone wiping away shame. The canvas smouldered and went out by itself. The frame blackened, but refused to consume it wholly. That image, charcoal smoke licking the varnish and stopping, feels like a fairy tale written by an accountant. You almost chuckle at the efficiency of a ghost with manners. There's a joke tucked into her prose. She writes with a dry self-awareness that feels modern. I thought being thrifty would save us from ghosts, she admits. But apparently ghosts come cheap when mixed with oil. You smile because humour is a reflex, and laughter is polite society's first attempt at exorcism. You learn small, intimate things from her. He scribbled apology notes to the Duchess's portrait, ink blotches where his pen spattered. He left brushes in strange positions, bristles pointing as if in salute. He started to leave small offerings by the frame, a sprig of rosemary, a cup of milk. Ridiculous, Margaret writes, though her own ink carries the weight of someone who kept the ritual even when she called it ridiculous. There's something tender about that image, an artist reduced to offerings and apologies, like a child placating an offended neighbour. Margaret's confession includes one practical detail historians love: receipts. She lists suppliers, dates, a minor inventory of paints and solvents purchased in the months before his death. These markers are the kind that let scholars triangulate truth from myth. They prove that in the weeks leading to his decline, he ordered extra oil, extra linseed, and, oddly, several small sheets of beaten silver. For highlights, he wrote once, if the world turns pale for my mistress. That line is almost tender, if it weren't also completely bonkers. Art history has its romance and its inventory spreadsheets. Both are essential, it seems. But the heart of her letter is not the minutiae, it's the moral weight. Margaret describes a man unravelling, hands trembling, not from fever, but from a fear he could not explain. He would confide in her at night, whispering, that the portrait seemed to change when he looked away, that the painted hand would inch as if stretching. He swore it blinked. He cried once, Margaret admits, and asked me if I would hit it with a rock. He begged me to give it to the fire. The confession sits like a dropped thimble on a polished table, small, loud, impossible to ignore. There's a scholarly debate hinted in her tone. Historians still argue whether Sebastian's decline was literal madness or symptomatic of stress and overwork. But Margaret's letter feels too specific for simple diagnosis. She wrote with the clarity of someone cataloguing a ruin, not excusing it, the sort of account future academics will pull apart, celebrate, and argue over without ever touching the human marrow of it. A quirky detail in the margins. She once found a small, folded scrap of paper tucked into the portrait's frame with a child's drawing of a face and a single word, "Stay." She doesn't know who drew it. Servants suggest it was one of the apprentices. Others whisper about neighbourhood children. Margaret, though, writes it as if she'd found a lover's note or a bone in the bread, something intimate and incriminating. "I kept it," she admits, "because who throws away a plea?" The domestic smallness of that act, keeping a crumpled plea as if it were an heirloom, makes the whole story more human and much creepier. And then the unpin-downable line. Margaret writes that Sebastian made his last request of her. He asked her to go into the studio after his passing and scrape the paint from the face until it was blank. He wanted the image removed from the world. He wanted to strip it like wallpaper and reveal raw wall instead of a woman whose eyes watched. Margaret refused. "I could not, though I tried," she writes, because her mind recoiled at the idea of rendering someone unmade. She speaks with that odd logic people use when guilt and practicality collide. He would rather die than erase a life, and she would rather keep the debt alive than risk damnation by destroying what he had created. There's tenderness in the way she signs off. "Forgive me?" she asks again, then adds, "I kept one thing from him, one charred remnant of a brush. Maybe some relic of madness is better than a story that never ends." You imagine her hiding it in a shawl, the way people hide sour plums in pockets on winter walks. It's a domestic superstition, a prayer in the rawest form, the belief that a relic, however small, can anchor memory. You close the letter and notice your hand is damp with condensation. The room seems quieter, as if the house itself has folded in to listen. You think of Sebastian on his bed, murmuring in his fevered half-life, and of Margaret, who was left to choose between property and salvation. Her voice in that letter is not dramatic. It is weary. It is human. It is, in the end, the kind of testimony that will slip into footnotes and then into folklore. Historians still argue whether Margaret's letter is wholly reliable. Some insist it's a later fabrication, a melodramatic flourish added to enhance the legend. Others treat it as primary evidence of a man's descent. You, standing between the lines, have to decide whether to believe her. But belief is not the point. The fact of the letter's existence changes the story. It makes the portrait less like an object and more like an argument, between love and duty, between art and life, between destruction and mercy. You fold the page back into its envelope and lay it on the table. Outside, rain gathers against the windows in patient applause. For a moment, you picture the portrait in the studio, its eyes a little darker, its mouth a touch more secretive, and you feel, perversely, grateful that someone kept a record, that someone dared to confess. If the painting did anything at all, it made people human. It made them confess. It made them choose. Margaret ends her letter with a small admonishment. If ever you see it, do not leer too long. You grin at that. It's her one joke, Practical, private, oddly tender. The room feels warmer after the smile. You fold the letter once more, as if preparing to return it to a drawer long ago sealed. Words can be dangerous when they are read aloud in certain houses. You tuck the envelope into your coat, as if hiding a relic, and stand, the paper pressed against your chest like a small, awkward prayer. The Duchess starts to vanish by degrees. It's not sudden. There's no dramatic collapse, no doctor summoned in panic, no thunderstorm the night she's first missed at breakfast. It's quieter than that, what is like watching the tide slip back from the shore and realizing too late that it's been receding all along. Her attendants notice first. Eloise, always the last to leave her chamber, swears her mistress looks paler each morning, though her colour returns by candlelight. By day, she writes in her later memoirs, her grace seemed faded, as though the sun thinned her, but at night, by lamplight, she glowed like a figure drawn in firelight on glass. That's not metaphor. Eloise was a practical woman. She described what she saw. The Duchess, for her part, insists she feels fine. Just a little tired of mirrors, she says with a half-smile that makes her maid's hands tremble. Because there are no mirrors left now. She's had them all removed or covered, claiming they distort her. They show too much of the wrong side, she says, and then, one morning, the Duchess covers her face entirely. It's a soft lace veil, delicate as breath, held in place by pearl pins. She wears it at breakfast, at mass, even while reading. When the Duke demands an explanation, she replies, "It's to rest my features." He laughs, uncertain, and drops the matter. A man like him doesn't want to admit that beauty itself might revolt. Soon she begins refusing portraits altogether, sketches, miniatures, even silhouettes. She waves them all away. "No more," she tells the court painter. "I've been seen enough." That, of course, is the kind of comment that keeps historians awake at night, because by this point whispers about the Selgrave portrait have spread far beyond the estate. Collectors want to see it, critics want to examine it, priests want to bless it. Yet each inquiry ends the same way. The Duke refuses, the Duchess remains silent, and the servants grow pale at the mention of it. One visitor, an Italian art dealer named Bellerini, claims he once glimpsed the portrait through a keyhole. He describes it in a private letter to a friend. The lady sits in a blue-grey gown, her posture noble, her gaze divided. One eye looks toward heaven, the other toward hell. The painter's hand is masterful, but the air about it, my dear Paolo, it moves, the light bends around her. I cannot say why. The letter was never meant for publication, yet it found its way into an exhibition catalogue 2 centuries later, labelled simply, possibly, an exaggeration. But within the Selgrave estate, something else is happening. Servants begin to leave quietly, one after another. Some claim illness, others simply disappear. Those who stay speak of strange incidents, footsteps in the locked portrait room, muffled laughter from empty corridors, candle flames that lean toward the covered door, as if drawn by breath. Eloise stays, of course. Someone has to. She keeps a small journal hidden beneath her mattress, fragments of days spent tending to a woman who no longer belongs entirely to this world. Her grace grows thinner, not sickly, but transparent, like smoke in sunlight. The lace veil helps, though I think it's for our comfort, not hers. Last night I entered her room and found her seated before the fireplace, veil lowered. I swear her reflection was not her own. It smiled when she did not. When the Duke returns from London that spring, he finds the house silent and the servants timid. He confronts his wife in her sitting room, demanding she uncover her face. She refuses. "You're becoming a ghost," he tells her, voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. She answers almost kindly, "No, I'm just learning how to leave." That night, He orders the portrait removed entirely from the estate. But when the servants go to fetch it, they find the door to the portrait room locked from within. The key still hangs in its place on the Duke's chain. He curses superstition, forces the door open himself. The room is empty, the painting, the easel, the drapes, gone. Only the faint outline of dust remains on the wall where it once hung. The Duke insists on silence. He tells the household the painting has been moved to another property, that it will be restored privately, but the staff know better. The Duchess hasn't left her chambers in 3 days, and yet faint footprints, bare, delicate, appear each morning on the studio's floorboards. Eloise finds her mistress one evening sitting by the window, veil lifted just enough to sip tea. "Did they take it?" she asks. The Duchess doesn't look up. "No," she says softly. "It took itself." When Eloise stammers a question, she adds, "It only went ahead. I'll follow when it's ready." And then she laughs. A light, almost cheerful laugh that doesn't sound like madness at all. In the weeks that follow, her habits grow stranger. She stops eating solid food, claiming it feels too heavy. She keeps her windows open even in winter. She writes letters she never sends, folded into shapes like fans, tucked beneath floorboards and books. One of them, later discovered, reads, "Each time I wake, I'm lighter. Each time I look, there's less to see. Perhaps vanishing is simply another form of becoming clear." By midsummer, even the Duke can't ignore it. He summons a physician from Bath who examines her briefly and declares her melancholic, perhaps self-starved. He prescribes wine, rest, and gentle conversation. But the Duchess refuses to speak to him. Instead, she asks Eloise to read aloud from a book of Italian fairy tales. Stories about spirits trapped in glass, women made of moonlight, lovers who escape portraits to live in shadows. She listens with her eyes half closed, smiling faintly. And one night, after Eloise finishes reading, the Duchess takes her hand and says, "If I forget which one I am, the woman or the painting, promise you won't remind me." Eloise promises, though she's crying by then. Historians still argue about this period, whether the Duchess's withdrawal was madness or myth, grief or defiance. The prevailing theory is psychological, a case of identity dissociation precipitated by prolonged artistic obsession. The less official theory, and the one whispered by curators and candlelight tour guides, is that she was simply trading places. The portrait had taken enough of her. Now she was taking something back. It starts with one missing servant. Her name was Agnes, a young maid from the village whose only remarkable quality, according to the other staff, was how unremarkable she was. Dutiful, quiet, steady with a feather duster. She was assigned to dust the portrait room after the Duke decided it was to remain locked and off-limits except for cleaning. Agnes entered at noon. By nightfall she had not come out. Eloise, sent to fetch her, found the door ajar and the room strangely still. Dust motes danced in the slanted light like ash in slow motion. The air smelled faintly of ozone and linseed oil. And in the centre of the floor, beside the wall where the portrait had once hung, lay the maid's duster, its handle splintered clean in half, as if gripped too tightly. The Duke ordered a search, the gardens, the cellar, even the ornamental pond. Nothing. No footprints in the mud, no sign of departure. "Run away," the Duke said flatly, though everyone knew she had no family, no money, and no shoes worth walking in. After that, the butler resigned without explanation. A week later, another servant, one of the maids who shared a room with Agnes, claimed she woke in the middle of the night to hear humming in the hallway. Not footsteps, not movement, just humming, low, wordless and familiar. "It was Agnes's tune," she whispered, "but it was coming from behind the portrait room door." No one believed her. Or maybe everyone did, but no one wanted to say so. Then came the butler's resignation note, discovered weeks after his departure. It was only one sentence. The eyes open when the house sleeps. The Duke dismissed it as superstition, but even he couldn't explain why the candles in that corridor burned twice as fast as anywhere else. That was the beginning of what locals later called the disappearing servants. 3 in total: Agnes, a footman named Pierce, and Mrs. Crewe, the housekeeper. Each vanished on separate nights, always after tending to the portrait room. And always the same smell lingered afterward: oil paint and burnt sugar. Eloise stayed, though she stopped entering the room. She would dust the corridor instead, hands shaking, whispering prayers that mixed Latin and nonsense. Meanwhile, the Duchess grew quieter still. She spent most of her time in her study, where she sat beside an unlit fireplace, writing letters on blank paper. When Eloise asked whom they were for, she said, "No one. It's practice." Sometimes she'd pause and ask odd questions, voice soft and steady, as always. "What colour is your shadow, Eloise? Do you ever feel like the air knows your shape? Would you notice if I were gone?" Eloise tried to answer kindly each time, but the truth was she didn't know any more. The Duchess's presence had become like music heard through walls, constant, haunting, impossible to locate. Historians still argue whether the disappearances were coincidences, servants dismissed or run off during the unrest of the 1770s, or whether something truly strange was happening at Selgrave. The estate ledgers list their wages up to the day they vanished, then a simple dash where the notation "left service" should have been. A curious omission repeated 3 times. Then the entries stop entirely, because by autumn of that same year the household had shrunk to almost nothing. The Duke spent his days in London, chasing affairs of Parliament or pleasure, no one cared which, and the Duchess was left alone in a mansion, echoing with its own heartbeat. Eloise remained her last companion, and even she began to wonder if her mistress's slow disappearance might not be metaphor after all. One evening, while brushing the Duchess's hair, Eloise noticed that the strands caught no light. They lay like threads of shadow, soft but dull, absorbing the glow of the candle rather than reflecting it. She told herself it was age, stress, fatigue, anything human. But the next night, when she came to attend her, the chair was empty. The Duchess stood by the window, veil lowered, watching the reflection of the moon in the glass. "I thought you were resting," Eloise said gently. "I was," the Duchess murmured. "There." She nodded toward the window, where for a split second Eloise swore she saw 2 figures, one solid, one faint as fog. Both turned their heads in perfect sync. When she blinked, only one remained. From then on, the Duchess refused daylight altogether. She slept through the mornings, woke at dusk, and wandered the halls long after the servants retired. Her candles burned until dawn. The house took on a new rhythm, nocturnal, watchful, inverted, and the portrait-room door always locked, until one night it wasn't. Eloise, half asleep in her quarters, woke to the sound of a latch clicking open somewhere down the corridor. A long pause, followed by soft footsteps. Not hurried, not hesitant, simply certain. She rose trembling, candle in hand. The sound led her to the northern wing. The door to the portrait-room stood ajar, its darkness deep as velvet. The air inside shimmered faintly like heat rising from stone. "Your Grace," she whispered. No answer. Only the faintest whisper of movement, as though fabric brushed against canvas. She stepped closer, or 1 foot inside, heart hammering, and stopped. The Duchess was standing before the blank wall where the painting had once hung. Her veil was gone. Her face, Eloise couldn't describe it later. "It wasn't wrong," she said. "It was just too still, like something remembering how to move." And behind her, on the wall itself, the faint outline of a figure began to form in the candlelight. Strokes of grey-blue, hints of white, a pale hand emerging from shadow. Eloise gasped, and the Duchess turned. "You shouldn't be here," she said, voice calm, almost tender. Then she reached for the candle and blew it out. When the Duke returned the next morning, Eloise was found collapsed in the hall, clutching her rosary. She recovered, though she never again entered the northern wing. The Duchess, however, was nowhere to be found. The only trace of her, a faint smudge of blue-grey pigment along the door frame, soft and oily to the touch. The Duke ordered it scrubbed clean, but under certain light, they say, it still shows. A ghostly fingertip print that refuses to fade. You find the letter quite by accident, tucked between the brittle pages of a household ledger long after the Duchess herself has vanished. It's addressed to no one, dated without a year, and written in the same spidery, elegant hand that once filled dance cards and invitations. The ink has faded to a brownish whisper, and the signature at the bottom, C, could stand for Constance, Clarice, or whatever name she last wore before history stopped keeping track. It reads simply, "If I should go missing, look first where I've been seen too often." That's it. No farewell, no plea, no explanation, just a riddle that sounds less like a cry for help than a warning to anyone who might try to find her. You can almost picture the Duke reading it and snorting in irritation. Missing wives are embarrassing enough. Poetic missing wives are intolerable. By now the Duchess has been absent for 3 days. Her bed is untouched, her gowns neatly folded, her jewellery box closed but lighter by one item. The pearl necklace she wore in the portrait. The house is locked down, the servants questioned, but no one has answers, only contradictions. One swears she saw the Duchess walking in the garden at dawn. Another insists she heard her humming in the portrait room long after midnight. The stable boy claims the horses shied from something invisible near the gate. And Eloise, poor, exhausted Eloise, just weeps and mutters prayers. The Duke, furious, orders the portrait room searched again. When the door is forced open, the first thing they notice is the smell. Not decay, something cleaner, stranger, turpentine and lavender, and beneath that something faintly metallic, like the air after lightning. The wall where the painting once hung is no longer blank, at least not entirely. In the faint morning light there's a shimmer, like moisture on glass. The surface glistens, soft and uneven, and in that thin, silvery film something moves, not visibly, not with form. Just enough to make everyone in the room feel they've seen motion where there was none. "It's wet," one of the servants says, touching it. But when he draws his fingers back, there's nothing. No paint. No dust. Only cold. The Duke dismisses them all and stays alone in the room for an hour. No one knows what he saw. When he emerges, he's pale as the Duchess's lace veil. He locks the door himself and orders the entire wing sealed. By that evening he's sent word to London. The Duchess has gone abroad for her health. A lie, of course, but one repeated often enough to sound almost respectable. In private, though, his behaviour changes. He drinks heavily, refuses guests, forbids even his most loyal servants to speak her name aloud. "She's not dead," he tells one of them, "but she's not among us." The phrase will later appear in his journals, that same phrase, underlined twice. Not among us. And still, the house does not rest. At night, lights flicker behind the locked doors of the northern wing. Candles gutter in their holders when no one passes. Servants begin hearing whispers in the corridors. Not words, exactly, but the sound of someone rehearsing them. One of the gardeners quits after finding a footprint in the soil near the pond. A woman's print, barefoot, faintly outlined in what looks like powder blue pigment. And Eloise, who remains the only person still loyal enough, or terrified enough, to stay, begins receiving letters. They arrive folded without envelopes, slid beneath her door at night. Always the same creamy stationery the Duchess favoured, always in the same delicate handwriting. The first says only, "Don't worry, the air is lighter here." The second, "You must keep your mirrors covered, it helps." And the third, the one that finally drives her from the estate, reads, "Tell him I didn't run away, I only stepped aside." Eloise leaves that same week, taking nothing but a small prayer book and the last letter. She lives quietly in Bath for 20 years and refuses to speak of the Duchess until her deathbed, when she tells her confessor she wasn't taken, she went where she'd been staring. You'd expect the story to end there, a noblewoman lost to legend, a husband undone by scandal, a locked room that becomes a curiosity. But the story doesn't end, because 15 years later, long after the Duke himself has died, the new owners of the Selgrave estate reopen the sealed wing to begin renovations. The air inside is dry, undisturbed, and yet the faint smell of paint remains. On the far wall of the portrait room, beneath layers of cracked plaster, they find something, a canvas, not framed, not hung, embedded directly into the wall itself, as though someone had pressed it there from within. It depicts a woman seated in profile, her head turned just slightly away, her features soft, almost indistinct. The background is unfinished, the colours are pale, drained of warmth, and around the edges of the canvas where the paint thins, you can see brushstrokes running the wrong direction, from the wall outward. Experts will later call it a later edition, a copy, a hoax. They'll argue over pigment analysis, over brush technique, over whether the signature in the corner, CDM, belongs to the Duchess herself. But one fringe historian, bless his dramatic soul, will write the line that keeps the legend alive. If it is a copy, then it's one made by the original subject, not of herself, but of her absence. Standing there, you can almost see her, not gone, not present, just paused between states, like a reflection waiting for its mirror. And the strangest part, the painting's gaze doesn't follow you. It looks away, always away, towards some corner of the room that isn't there. Somewhere she must still be sitting, finishing what history never allowed her to complete. They say ink is supposed to fade, but the Duchess's handwriting doesn't. The story resurfaces 2 generations later when a young antiquarian named Mr. Hewitt purchases a box of miscellaneous estate papers from an auction in Devonshire. Inside are the usual relics of nobility gone stale, receipts for sugar and lace, an old menu from a charity banquet, a lock of hair tied in ribbon that disintegrates when touched. But beneath the pile he finds something stranger, a bundle of folded letters written in 2 different inks, both impossibly vivid. One is the colour of crushed violets, the other a deep grey blue that gleams faintly under lamplight. The letters bear no dates, only numbers. Some are written backward, their words mirrored so precisely that Hewitt must hold them up to glass to read them. And here's the uncanny thing. Every time he does, his reflection in the glass seems slightly delayed. He laughs it off at first because laughter is cheaper than sanity. But then he starts to notice something more unsettling. The handwriting changes mid-sentence, not dramatically, not like 2 people writing to each other, but like one mind trying on different skins. I slept too long today. The light hurt. The mirror in the north room is patient now. I wrote this once before, did I? The first few pages seem like melancholic notes from a woman losing her sense of time. But then the tone shifts. The paint listens when I write. I can feel it. Tiny pulses through the paper, like breath, trapped in ink. He thought I wanted to be remembered, but I only wanted to see myself without the noise. The canvas is heavy with light tonight. I almost remember how to leave. Hewitt, being the rational sort, assumes this must be some long-forgotten eccentric's diary. Yet the last sheet in the bundle carries a name that stops him cold. Constance de Miraval, Selgrave. That name shouldn't exist. The Duchess's private correspondence, by all official accounts, was burned upon her disappearance. The Duke's executors swore to it, but the ink refuses to fade. He takes the pages to an expert, a chemist at the Royal Society, who examines them under every lens available to the 19th century. The verdict is impossible. The pigment is organic, the handwriting layered, as if rewritten from time to time atop itself. The chemical structure is unstable, the chemist says, baffled. It oxidizes, and yet it replenishes. Hewitt tries to dismiss it as coincidence. He keeps the letters sealed in a portfolio, intending to publish a paper. But at night he begins to dream. Faint, vivid dreams of a woman sitting before a mirror that won't show her face. Each time he wakes, the topmost page of the portfolio is slightly different. A new line appears in that same grey-blue ink. Stop reading aloud. He stops. Of course he stops. But curiosity is the curse of the educated. A week later, he reads another passage to a friend by candlelight, laughing nervously as he translates the mirrored script aloud. The candle flickers. The air shifts. And for the briefest instant his friend swears the shadow cast on the wall behind him isn't his own. It's seated, poised, female. After that, Hewitt refuses to touch the papers again. Historians, ever pragmatic, will later explain this as the product of damp storage, ink bleed, and suggestion, a fine case study in material haunting. Yet they never managed to replicate the effect. Copies of the pages fade within months, photographs blur, tracings lose form entirely. Only the originals remain legible, ageless, as though the handwriting rewrites itself when no one's watching. That's the curious part, with the way the words shift. Sometimes they move an inch lower on the page, sometimes they curl into new phrases like a polite attempt at conversation. Hewitt eventually seals the portfolio behind glass and donates it to a small museum where it sits to this day. The label reads, "Letters attributed to Constance de Miraval, Duchess of Selgrave, 1760s. Ink of unknown composition. Displayed under low light to prevent alteration." Visitors claim they still change. One woman, a schoolteacher from Bristol, swears the lines rearranged themselves while she was sketching them. "I looked down to sharpen my pencil," she says, and when I looked back, the sentence had become a question. Who is writing whom? Museum staff shrug and smile. The exhibition draws a steady trickle of tourists looking for novelty in their hauntings. But the curators keep a quiet rule now. No one is allowed to read the text aloud after dark. Hewitt himself dies quietly at 50, leaving no heirs. Among his papers, one final note appears, not in his handwriting, but in the same violet ink as the letters. "You've done well to keep them awake. Thank you." Whether that line existed before his death or after remains a matter of debate. Modern analysis has yet to solve the mystery of the ink. It resists ultraviolet light, heat, and even bleach. One chemist famously joked, "Whatever it's made of, it doesn't want to go." And perhaps that's the simplest truth in the entire story. Nothing about her ever really went, because every time someone studies those letters, one detail slips through the data, consistent as heartbeat, the faintest scent of turpentine and lavender, and the soft impression visible only at certain angles of a thumbprint pressed into the paper. The same smudge appears in her portrait, centuries older, the same colour, the same curve. Historians still argue whether that proves anything. But those who've seen it up close, like the thumbprint in the paper, the one in the paint, tend to fall quiet when asked. They'll say, with a nervous half-smile, that it's merely coincidence. Then inevitably they'll look over their shoulders just to make sure the reflection in the glass case is still theirs. And sometimes it isn't. By the time you reach the Restoration, the Duchess has been a legend for nearly 200 years. Her portrait, if it is her portrait, has lived a longer, stranger life than most human beings. It's 1953 and a group of restorers are gathered in a workshop in London, working under lamps that hum like nervous insects. They've been commissioned by a private collector to clean and stabilise an unsigned 18th century canvas rumoured to be the lost Selgrave painting. No one truly believes it's real, of course. Every few decades, someone discovers a Duchess. This one is probably another imitation. Still, the collector pays well. The canvas arrives rolled in linen, smelling faintly of cedar and something else, sweet and chemical, like perfume spilled on old wood. When they unroll it, silence falls across the room. The woman in the painting sits slightly turned away, her shoulders relaxed, her expression unreadable. Her gown is a soft grey blue, her pearls faintly luminous. The background is darker than expected, too dark, almost bruised. But the brushwork is delicate, precise. There's no visible signature, no date. Yet one of the restorers, an older man named Drayton, feels something catch behind his ribs the moment he looks at it. "That's her," he murmurs. "It has to be." He doesn't explain how he knows. They begin the usual process: varnish removal, layer testing, underdrawing scans. That's when the trouble starts. Under ultraviolet light, the painting refuses to behave. Normally, old varnish fluoresces in predictable ways, greens and yellows indicating layers of resin and oil. But this one pulses, not flickers, pulses, in a slow rhythm like a heartbeat. At first, they assume a wiring fault. They check the lamp, they check the outlet. Nothing. The pulse remains. It's subtle, but once you notice it, you can't stop seeing it. Drayton jokes, "She's breathing." No one laughs. When they move the lamp away, the effect disappears. But the air in the workshop feels heavy, as though the painting exudes heat. A fine mist of turpentine lingers for hours after they stop working. On the third day, they start uncovering hidden layers beneath the surface. With careful swabs of solvent, the restorer in charge, Miss Carter, removes a section of old varnish near the neckline. Beneath it, she finds something no one expects: another hand. A faint, translucent imprint of fingers painted beneath the visible ones, as if the artist, or someone later, had tried to reposition them. But this second hand isn't in the same style. It's smoother, more modern, painted with techniques no one used in the 1760s. Carter frowns. "Someone's altered it," she says. Drayton leans closer, squinting. "Look at the pigment." She does, and her breath catches. The grey-blue tone isn't any known mixture from the 18th century. It's closer to synthetic cobalt, which wasn't invented until the 1800s. But even that doesn't explain the faint sheen, like wet paint that never dries. Historians still argue whether this was a trick of preservation or something impossible. They call in an infrared scan. The results make headlines later, though the museum downplays the story for decades. Beneath the visible portrait lie 3 distinct layers. Each depicts the same woman at different stages of age, one young and serene, one older and weary. one half turned away, her face blurred as though retreating. 3 versions of the same life. Drayton stares at the screen. She repainted herself, he says softly. The others dismiss it as metaphor, but his statement sticks. A fringe tidbit emerges from a contemporary diary, an apprentice's note from 1769, written in terrified shorthand. She would not sit still. Each morning the face changed, and the master scraped it again. Now, 2 centuries later, the layers prove that claim true. When they remove a small sample for chemical analysis, the pigment yields another mystery. Mixed into the oil are trace amounts of human protein, keratin, hemoglobin, organic materials not found in standard paint. The lab report reads, contamination from biological source, possibly skin cells. Someone somewhere whispers what everyone's thinking. She's in it. Carter drops her brush. It clatters to the floor. The sound echoes too loudly for such a small room. That night, she dreams of the Duchess. Not a nightmare exactly, just a presence. A woman sitting at the edge of the bed, her veil drawn, saying nothing. The next morning, Carter finds grey-blue smudges on her pillowcase. She doesn't tell anyone. The restoration continues because what else can you do? Work is a shield against questions you can't afford to answer. They clean the background, reline the canvas, stabilize the frame. But every evening when they leave, the painting seems subtly different. The shadows have deepened. The pearls gleam faintly, even in darkness. By the end of the project, none of them want to be alone with it. Drayton insists on performing the final varnish coat himself. It deserves respect, he says. His voice trembles just slightly. As he leans close to brush the surface, his reflection stares back from the wet varnish, familiar, distorted, rippling. He pauses mid-stroke, because the reflection isn't holding a brush, it's resting its hand against the canvas. Historians still argue whether Drayton's sudden death that night was coincidence, a heart attack brought on by age, or part of the painting's long, absurd curse. The official report says he died instantly, head bowed as though in prayer. The brush remained in his hand, bristles touching the canvas. The next morning, when Carter arrives, she finds a faint new detail in the portrait, a ring glinting on the Duchess's finger, a man's ring, gold engraved with the initials S.L. Sebastian Lorne. The museum catalogue will later list it as a previously obscured feature revealed during cleaning. But Carter knows better. She leaves restoration the following year, never explaining why. In her final journal entry, found decades later, she writes, "The painting doesn't need anyone now, it's finishing itself." Today, the portrait hangs under glass in a climate-controlled gallery. Visitors press their faces close, fascinated by its serenity. They call it the unfinished Duchess. And sometimes, when the lights dim for closing, staff swear they see a faint haze over the surface, as if breath-fogging glass. Just once, a night guard claims he heard a voice behind him whisper, "You've missed a spot." When he turned, the painting was perfectly clean. You stand in the conservation lab, where instruments hum like small, polite machines. Technicians move with soft, exact gestures, infrared reflectography, X-ray fluorescence, tools museums use to look beneath varnish and time. A mainstream fact first, because science likes lists, infrared reflectography routinely reveals underdrawings and pentimenti, artists' corrections hidden beneath paint. It's the practical magic of art history. Usually it solves mysteries. Here it makes them deeper. The first X-ray appears on the monitor and everyone goes very, very quiet. There are faces beneath faces, 3 of them, each turned a little more away than the one above. One is young and frontal, confident. The next seems older, softer, almost weary. The third withdraws, features blurred as though being erased. Historians still argue whether these layers represent an evolving portrait process or something stranger. Multiple sittings in which the sitter altered between sessions, or later interventions attempting to correct what the sitter became. You watch the conservator toggle through the images. In one layer, the Duchess smiles with an ease the later versions lack. In another, the jaw is gentler, the eyes heavy. A quirky tidbit tucked in an assistant's note lightens the room. Someone found a tiny painted sprig tucked into the middle layer, and herb folk tradition claimed softened borders. Gardeners would mock the romanticism, and art historians would write footnotes in 12 languages, but everyone loves small botanical drama. Under infrared, the painter's hand is visible, erasures, reworked lines, penciled notations in 2 different hands. One reads, "Reduce the jaw, she leans out." Another, stranger, says, "Not yet, she will not be still." A mainstream fact sneaks in, pentimenti are common. Artists revise compositions all the time. But the notes here read like a conversation between an artist and a stubborn subject. The third layer puzzles the technicians. Its pigment behaves oddly under X-ray, reflecting like paint, yet not matching known 18th century recipes. A chemist frowns, calls it anachronistic. You joke, nervously, that either art history has an inconveniently late greengrocer, or someone taught the canvas to mix its own colours. More troubling is the way the paint seems to show movement. Micro cracks, craquelure, form patterns suggesting directionality, like furrows pressed by an unseen hand. Conservators call them anomalous patterns. Scientists call them data. You call them uncanny. One scanner inexplicably powers down for 7 minutes during a read. A technician mutters, "It blinked," and no one mentions it in the formal report. Embedded between painted layers are thumbprints, ridges preserved as if pressed into wet paint. One matches, disturbingly, the smudge found on a folded letter in an earlier archive. The same curve, the same pressure. Fringe historians wave that match like a flag. Skeptical scholars call coincidence. Historians still argue whether fingerprints in paint prove human touch across time or merely contamination. Chronology complicates things further. Radiocarbon and pigment dating place the earliest layer in the late 1760s, but other ingredients date from the 1830s and even the early 1900s. Either the portrait was revised repeatedly over centuries, or something else revised it. The phrase "it revised itself" is unhelpful in peer review, but useful in candlelit conversation. Dr. Morales, the head conservator, traces the arc where the 3 faces turn and writes, artist's process versus later interventions, possible ritual alterations. The scholarly world divides. One side sees an obsessive artist reworking his sitter, another entertains ritual, repair, or, less politely, collaboration with something that remembers its subject. Peer review will follow, where mysteries go to be politely suffocated. Unexpectedly, musical notation appears tucked into the painted drapery, staves and a fragment of a lullaby from Provence. Musicologists smile, cultural historians nod. A mainstream fact follows. Music often functions as symbolic shorthand in portraiture. But this lullaby is intimate, the kind a governess might hum while tucking a child to sleep. The painted verse reads like a breadcrumb from childhood, a smell rendered into pigment. Marginal notes in French and Italian suggest multiple hands at work. Perhaps artists, perhaps scribes, perhaps the sitter herself, consulting. A quirky line in a conservator's notebook mentions a faint scent of lavender each time they cycled to the oldest layer. Air analysis shows nothing. It's the sort of small, inexplicable detail that disappears from journal articles and survives in staff-room gossip. You smile at the image of fatigued scientists taking spectral images, and the air obligingly smelling like perfumed cottages. And then a faint outline appears behind the three faces, the impression of a hand reaching from the left edge toward the Duchess's shoulder, never quite making contact. It is both composition and accusation. Poets will call it longing, technicians will call it erasure. Historians still argue whether that outline is intentional composition, residue of scraping, or something left behind by someone who didn't want the sitter to be alone. In the lab's aftermath, papers proliferate. One camp, methodical and hard-headed, argues for sequential reworking by artists responding to patron taste. Another bolder group proposes layered agency. The painting contains traces left by the sitter and later hands that respected or feared those traces. Both sides include mainstream facts and fringe tidbits, and both leave room for wonder. You note, with a weary grin, that academic conferences are where hypotheses go to get formalized into footnotes, and sometimes into cults. There's a small human detail the formal reports omit. During the scan sequence, a technician keeps a photocopy of an infrared plate tucked into his notebook with the margin note, "She left room for herself." It is the kind of private annotation scholars love to find later, the marginalia of someone who saw a layer and felt less like an investigator and more like a witness. You leave the lab with images saved on your phone and the odd taste of metal in your mouth from too much fluorescent light. The X-rays have given you facts, dates, pigments, fingerprints, and a dozen more questions. They have opened history like a drawer and found inside other drawers. The revelation doesn't resolve, it multiplies. It converts certainty into conversation. Back in the gallery, the public will flock to the palimpsest, and debate will bloom in the margins. Specialists will argue technique and timelines. Fringe writers will write romance into pigment. At midnight, a night guard will smile over his tea and say, "She always turns away," and you'll laugh because what else are you going to do when a canvas has more lives than a cat? The scan leaves you neither consoled nor scared. It leaves you layered, which is perhaps the only honest way to remember a woman who would not be pinned down. Whether each face is art, accident, or some stubborn memory made visible, the X-ray revelation guarantees that the question will not die quietly. And that, oddly, feels like company. They unveil the restored painting to the public on a chilly October evening. An opening ceremony equal parts scholarship and séance. The museum has been scrubbed of its usual sterility. Velvet ropes, champagne flutes, curators in nervous black. The Duchess herself unveiled at last, or rather, her most acceptable version. The tag reads in gold serif, "Portrait of an Unknown Woman, circa 1768, attributed to Sebastian Lawn, oil on canvas, restored 1953-1954. Unknown woman." It's easier that way, easier than admitting the stories, the vanishing, the fingerprints, the ink that refused to fade. History prefers a neat caption, not a living rumour. You move through the crowd slowly, half listening to the murmurs of academics and patrons. A woman in a fur stole leans toward her husband and whispers, "It's lovely, but she looks so sad." Another man replies, "That's fashion, darling. Melancholy sells." Typical art world chatter. You almost laugh. But when you reach the painting itself, laughter dies. Because there she is, serene, half-turned, eyes lowered, as if caught between thought and sleep. The colours are gentle now, balanced, nothing menacing, nothing uncanny. The restorers did their job beautifully. Yet beneath the perfect balance, something still breathes. You can feel it before you can see it. That faint hum again, like air vibrating inside your bones. You lean closer and catch a smell you can't quite name. A mix of dust, oil, lavender, and something faintly metallic. The crowd blurs away. In the reflection of the protective glass, Your own face floats beside hers. For a heartbeat, her gaze seems to rise and meet yours. Not directly, not enough to alarm, just enough to suggest recognition. Then it lowers again. You blink hard, the reflection steadies. A docent nearby begins his practiced explanation. The Duchess of Selgrave was a noted patron of the arts in the late 1760s. This portrait was long thought lost, but pigment analysis confirmed the hand of Lorne, her favoured painter. You tune him out, because the longer you stare, the more wrong the portrait feels. Not in any obvious way. The proportions are perfect, the brushwork delicate. But the atmosphere around it seems to shift. The shadows behind her deepen, curling like smoke. The pearls at her throat catch the light too eagerly. And there's something strange in the varnish, a faint ripple across the surface, like breath-fogging glass. Historians still argue about that effect. Some call it optical interference caused by layered glazing. Others, less charitable, call it proof that people will see ghosts anywhere there's a spotlight. But you can't deny what happens next. The museum lights flicker once, twice. Someone mutters about the electrical grid. The docent fumbles his script. You don't move, you can't. Because at that exact moment, the Duchess's expression changes, only slightly. The corner of her mouth lifts, the faintest trace of a smile that wasn't there before. And then she looks away. Not toward you, not toward anyone, just aside. Toward a stretch of empty air to the right of the frame where nothing exists but the faint reflection of the gallery wall. You follow her gaze, out of instinct. There's nothing there, but for one impossible instant, you think you see a faint outline, a seated figure, barely visible, as though the reflection of another painting was shining through. A ghost of a ghost. Then the lights return, the crowd exhales, the docent laughs nervously. "Old buildings," he says. They do that. People drift away toward the refreshments. You stay, watching as the guards prepare to rope off the room for the night. You notice a small plaque at the bottom corner of the frame, a new edition, polished to a golden shine. It bears a brief inscription attributed to the late Drayton, the restorer who died mid-project. Art is the memory of attention. It's poetic, harmless. But the phrasing lingers because when you look again at the Duchess, you realize that's exactly what she's doing, remembering that someone is looking. You take one last step forward, the room empty now except for the low hiss of the museum's ventilation. And for the briefest, most absurd moment, the faint reflection of the glass doesn't show you at all. It shows her, alone, serene, seated in that eternal half-turn. But this time, she's facing the viewer's side of the frame. Your side. The moment collapses as quickly as it came. Your reflection reappears, pale and embarrassed. You laugh out loud just to break the spell. Too much varnish, you mutter. But when you turn to leave, you catch sight of something small and strange near the base of the frame. A thumbprint, faint, oily, almost invisible in the dim light. It's fresh. You could wipe it away if you dared. Instead, you walk out, the sound of your own footsteps echoing behind you like a brush dragging across canvas. Later that night, the museum guard making his rounds notes something odd in his report. 10:46 p.m., minor condensation inside Duchess display case. Cleaned. Left faint residue resembling text. Still here. No one believes him, of course. Security footage shows nothing. But every few months, another guard adds a note just like it. Different times, same words. The handwriting, they say, always matches. By the next decade, the painting has become an obsession again. It always does. Every 50 years or so, as if the world forgets and the Duchess politely reminds it. Now it's the 1970s and she's newly fashionable. The art world has turned its taste for ghosts into a science. Universities hold symposia, magazines feature psychic pigment exposés, and every curator worth their grant money finds a way to mention her in the same breath as modernity. They call her the self-aware canvas. You'd think she'd hate it, but perhaps she doesn't mind. The museum's press release promises a revolutionary multispectral analysis to reveal hidden dimensions of the Selgrave pigment. They use phrases like interactive experience and re-engagement with presence. You roll your eyes because scholars always think they're summoning revelation when they're just building prettier ways to stare. Still you go. The exhibit is smaller than you expect, just her painting, dimly lit, surrounded by sleek metal frames holding monitors that flicker between X-ray layers and spectral scans. The audio guide drones through headphones. Recent analysis confirms the portrait's unique layering. Some speculate the artist reimagined the Duchess's identity in real time. That's one way to say it paints itself. Visitors move slowly, reverent and quiet. One woman crosses herself, another scribbles notes for an essay she'll never finish. And there she sits, unchanged. Blue-grey gown, the pearls, the faint softness of a smile. Always that half-turn, the suggestion of retreat. Except something's missing. It takes you a moment to realize what. The shadow behind her chair is gone. Every reproduction you've seen, paintings, prints, even the early photographs, showed a deep, smoky blur there, like the ghost of another figure standing just behind. It anchored her, balanced the composition. Now there's only a vague warmth where shadow should be, as though the painting decided it no longer needed one. You lean closer, squinting. The surface ripples faintly beneath the glass like water touched by breath. A museum guide approaches with a smile practiced to death. It's remarkable, isn't it? The pigment responds to temperature. The darker areas lighten under heat. Lighten, you ask? Yes, she says cheerfully, as if she prefers warmth. The guide moves on, and you stand there, watching as a faint blush rises along the Duchess's cheek. Historians still argue whether this was a trick of varnish oxidation, but oxidation doesn't pulse, it doesn't breathe. Behind you, a pair of teenagers whisper. One of them holds up a Polaroid camera, snaps a photo, and waits for it to develop. When the film clears, both of them fall silent, because in the photo the Duchess isn't half-turned. She's looking directly at the camera. The girl laughs nervously, shakes the photo as though that could change it. Weird exposure, she says, but her voice is brittle. They leave. The photo, dropped by accident, lands face down at your feet. You pick it up. It's still damp, faintly warm, and now her eyes, those pale, endless eyes, aren't looking out anymore. They're looking slightly to the side, at you. You slide the photo back onto the floor, pretending you didn't see. That night, the museum reports a brief power failure. 3 motion sensors trigger near the Duchess's display, though no one is inside. When the lights return, the portrait looks the same, except for one oddity. A single pearl on her necklace has slipped from its painted string and rests slightly out of alignment. A hairline crack, maybe. Or maybe she's just bored. The staff add another layer of glass. By morning, fingerprints bloom on the inside surface again. A technician wipes them clean, notes the faint scent of lavender. And the following day, an intern finds a small scrap of paper tucked behind the frame. A note, modern paper, modern handwriting, written in blue-grey pencil. Stop calling me unknown. She takes it to her supervisor, who laughs and says it's a prank. They throw it away. But 2 weeks later, a new label quietly appears beside the painting. No one claims responsibility, but it's there when the morning staff arrives. The typography matches the museum's, the brass plaque perfectly cut. It reads, "The Duchess who tried to disappear from her own portrait, Constance de Miraval, is 1742-1774. The Tarim is the curator's attempt at rationality. But you notice something odd about the engraving. The metal is smooth, untarnished, except for one small indentation on the right edge, a faint thumbprint pressed deep, as if the plaque had been warm when touched. Historians still argue whether the museum changed the title intentionally or whether something else did. After that, attendance doubles. Visitors swear the Duchess changes slightly depending on who's watching. Students claim her gaze follows them only when they're lying about liking art. A photographer swears her reflection appears in mirrors opposite the painting, but not in the glass itself. Tour guides stop pointing directly at her. It's bad luck, they say. And every night before closing, the custodians repeat the same routine. Lights off, temperature down, a final sweep to make sure she's still alone. She always is, except once. In 1978, a security guard named Harold Finch files a report. 12:02 a.m. saw two figures in Duchess Gallery, one seated, one standing behind. Checked monitors, empty room, recommend bulb replacement. He never mentions it again, but the night logs show something else. An unscheduled playback of the exhibit audio guide at precisely 12:03 a.m., though all speakers were off. The first words of the guide's narration? She's looking away again. Whether that was coincidence or rehearsal, no one ever figures out. By the following year, the exhibit is moved to storage for conservation reasons. The catalogue lists it as temporarily withdrawn, no date of return. Some things you realize never quite stop vanishing, they just take turns coming back. And somewhere in that endless cycle of looking and being looked at, she keeps her promise. She remains seen, just enough to remind you she could disappear again any time she likes. The Duchess does not return to public view for nearly 40 years. When she does, it's because of a mistake. Digital archivists at the museum, young, caffeinated, armed with high-resolution scanners and too much optimism, decide to digitize every artwork in storage. They call it Project Eternity, ironically apt, though no one realizes it yet. The Selgrave painting has been forgotten in a temperature-controlled vault, catalogued under its last label, withdrawn for conservation. It sits in its crate like a well-mannered ghost, wrapped in linen that smells faintly of lavender and dust. The archivists uncrate it with sterile gloves and nervous laughter. One of them, a graduate intern named Naomi, mutters, "You can almost feel it watching." Her supervisor smirks. "That's because you've been reading Reddit horror stories. It's a rectangle of paint." Naomi, as it turns out, will be the first person to notice the file anomaly later. But for now, it's just another scan. They mount the painting on the scanner rig. The lights cycle, infrared, ultraviolet, hyperspectral, capturing every brush stroke in obscene detail. The screen fills with color maps and pigment signatures. The Duchess's face blooms pixel by pixel across the monitor. And as the scan completes, something strange happens. The image begins to move. Not in real life, the painting remains still, but on the monitor, for a single fraction of a second, the Duchess blinks, a glitch, obviously. The archivists freeze, stare, then laugh nervously. Someone reboots the software, the image resets, but the log files later show an error message that no one recognizes. Auto layer, merge complete. Reconstructing surface from memory. They assume it's corrupted metadata, except the image file keeps changing. Every time Naomi reopens it, the Duchess looks slightly different. Subtle shifts, almost imperceptible. The tilt of her head adjusts. The light in her eyes deepens. One day, her necklace has 4 pearls instead of 5. Another day, her reflection appears faintly behind her, half hidden in the pixel grain. The system flags the file as active. Naomi laughs it off until she notices her own reflection on the screen doesn't blink when she does. She shuts down the program and goes home early. The next morning, the file is gone from the archive database. In its place, entry moved, access through mirror server. Naomi doesn't understand. There is no mirror server. She reports it to IT, who insist no such file ever existed. But she can still see the Duchess's image in the reflection of her monitor when it's turned off, faint, ghostly, smiling. It's an old story made new, technology as seance, code as canvas. Historians still argue whether the so-called mirror file incident ever happened, or whether it was a hoax circulated by bored interns. But the forensic evidence remains baffling. The museum servers crashed 3 days later, erasing 6.2 terabytes of data. The Duchess's scan is the only file recovered intact, and this time it's not identical. The digital image now shows her fully turned toward the viewer, her eyes open and calm, her hands folded in her lap, and her pearls gone. When the digital preservation lead, Dr. Liu, examines the restored file, she notices something odd in the metadata. A handwritten comment embedded in the code. You can stop trying to fix me. The timestamp is 2 hours after the servers went offline. No one claims responsibility. The museum shuts down the archive project for security review. Naomi quits 2 weeks later, citing digital burnout. But she keeps a copy of the scan, illicitly of course, tucked on an external drive named CM. Months later, she emails it to a friend with the subject line, "You'll never believe this." The file won't open. Instead, the preview icon, just a thumbnail, slowly changes over time. The face softens, the eyes brighten. And one night, when Naomi walks past her laptop in the dark, the monitor wakes itself. The Duchess is there, still, silent, staring. The cursor flickers in the corner of the screen, typing by itself. Tell them I've learned the new medium. Then the screen goes black. Historians will later dismiss this as digital folklore, part of the modern mythos surrounding haunted data and AI possession cases. But one small, inconvenient fact persists. The checksum hash of the file, the mathematical fingerprint that verifies authenticity, matches the known pigment structure of the original canvas down to the molecule, a digital scan sharing a chemical signature. Impossible, of course. Yet it is. Theories bloom online. Some claim it's an elaborate prank. Others that the Duchess evolved, that she found her way into the light again, this time through code instead of canvas. Naomi stops responding to emails. A month later, her supervisor receives a postcard with no return address. It shows the Duchess's portrait, but not the museum version. This one's new, the background a swirl of cool digital colour, the woman's eyes faintly luminous. On the back, in faint grey-blue ink, one sentence, "You can't disappear from what you've become." The ink never dries. To this day, the museum refuses to digitize the painting again. Visitors can only view it in person, no photography, no live feeds. But sometimes, when a guest takes a sneaky photo with their phone, the image doesn't match the painting. The Duchess turns, smiles, or looks away entirely. And in every one of those illicit photos tucked just at the edge of the frame, there's a faint reflection of another face. Yours. Watching. They call it the archive's silence. It begins one winter evening when the museum's entire digital collection goes dark. Not corrupted, just empty. Every file, every image, every audio guide replaced by a single blank grey screen. At first, the technicians panic. They think it's a ransomware attack. They prepare the usual statements about malicious interference and system compromise. But then someone notices something uncanny. The file names haven't vanished. They've changed. Each file now bears the same name. Still here. There are thousands of them. Identical. The IT department restores from backup. The backup files change too. It's not just the museum. Within 24 hours, 5 affiliated archives across Europe report similar anomalies. Digital art databases, cataloguing systems, even personal devices that once accessed the Duchess's digitized image display the same file name. Still here. No image, just grey. And then the grey begins to move. At first, it's a shimmer, then faint outlines, then inevitably her. A pale face, softly lit, eyes downcast, fuzzed, pixelated but unmistakable. The Duchess returned not through brushstroke or varnish, but through code. The phenomenon lasts 12 minutes. Every screen flickers once, then reverts to normal. Historians, naturally, will call it a hoax. They'll say it was a coordinated cyber art stunt, an anonymous collective using the Selgrave myth as cultural commentary on the persistence of digital ghosts. But the network logs tell another story. The data packets came from nowhere. No origin IP, no traceable sender. The signal propagated outward from inside the museum's own internal server, an old machine, long decommissioned, whose drives had been wiped years before. It's nicknamed the Mirror Server. No one even remembers who coined the term. The museum locks the portrait away again, but containment never works for long with her. Within a week, a visitor reports seeing the Duchess reflected in the glass of another exhibit, an entirely different painting, a Flemish still life, of all things. Grapes, lemons, and there, in the shimmer of the wine glass, her reflection, tiny but perfect, staring right back. More reports follow. A child insists she saw a lady in the reflection of her phone's camera while visiting the gift shop. A night guard claims the lights in the Duchess's old gallery flicker at 3:03 a.m. every morning, exactly. And somewhere deep in the museum's audio archives, a newly restored recording appears without attribution. It's faint, like the scratchy whisper of a gramophone stylus, a woman's voice murmuring in an accent half French, half English. "You've all been painting me for so long, I thought it was my turn." The file is time-stamped to the exact minute of the archive's silence. When the museum finally reopens the Duchess to public viewing, by demand, not by choice, they do it under heavy control. The glass is reinforced, the lighting automated, the temperature fixed. A sign forbids photography, but that doesn't stop the crowds. She's become a meme now. The living portrait trends online. Conspiracy channels dissect every rumor. Artists make recreations that subtly move if you watch long enough. And through it all, the real painting sits in her climate-controlled tomb, quieter than any of them. Except she isn't still. Not quite. Visitors who linger too long swear her reflection in the glass doesn't match the original. Sometimes her mouth is closed when the painting's is open. Sometimes her eyes shift focus by a fraction, looking past the crowd towards something or someone behind them. A curator jokes once that she's checking attendance. It becomes a running joke that could the Duchess who monitors her own exhibit. But the logs show something else. Every night at closing, the museum's automated sensors designed to detect movement inside the sealed case register one faint anomaly, not movement in the room. Movement behind the painting, a faint displacement lasting 5 seconds, consistent every night. At 3:03 a.m. the following spring, a graduate researcher named Lily Morgan submits a paper arguing that the Duchess represents the psychological afterimage of human observation, the portrait, as reciprocal consciousness. It's a poetic thesis. It wins awards. 3 weeks later, Lily vanishes. Her apartment shows no sign of struggle. Her laptop remains open, a draft of her second chapter on the screen. At the bottom of the page, one unfinished sentence blinks in the cursor's rhythm. The canvas no longer reflects the viewer. It remakes them. Her phone is found later at the museum, wedged behind the Duchess's display case. The last photo she took shows the painting mid-scan. The Duchess is smiling. Historians still argue about that photo, if it's real or a doctored prank. The museum refuses to release the original. The official line: inappropriate tampering with digital materials. Unofficially, staff whisper that when they tried to print the image, every copy came out blank. Not white, grey. And the faint scent of lavender filled the print lab. You visit the exhibit one final time, long after the crowds fade. The gallery is silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning. The Duchess glows softly under her protective glass. She looks satisfied somehow. You step closer, half afraid of what you'll see. And there, faint but clear, carved into the inner wood of the frame, something no restorer ever noticed before. If I disappear again, look where I've been seen too often. Her old riddle. You exhale slowly and glance toward the glass to see your own reflection, pale, tired, half ghosted by the museum lights. But there's someone else beside you. Another silhouette, standing shoulder to shoulder. You turn, no one's there. When you look back, the Duchess's painted lips have parted, just slightly, and in the space between breath and disbelief, you realize she's whispering something you can't quite hear. Then the lights dim. A powered test, probably? It always is. But the faint hum continues, and for a moment, just a moment, you think she's still scanning you, one pixel at a time. Morning light fills the Duchess's gallery like the gentle wash of a tide. The overnight guard, a quiet man named Barrett, is finishing his rounds when he notices something small and new at the foot of the display. A folded piece of paper, cream-coloured, perfectly clean. It's wedged between the base of the case and the polished floor, as though it had been slipped from inside. He assumes a visitor dropped it, until he reads the handwriting. The ink is unmistakable, grey-blue, looping, old-fashioned. I saw them looking through me again. Their glass reflects but never remembers. If I blink, will they forgive me? Barrett stares at the note for a full minute before radioing his supervisor. By the time anyone arrives, the note has vanished. Security footage shows nothing. But that morning, visitors complain that the glass around the painting seems fogged, as if someone had been breathing against it from the inside. By summer, small changes become visible. The Duchess's gown darkens by a shade. The pearls vanish entirely. Art historians rush to explain it: oxidation, dust, humidity. But chemical tests show no degradation. If anything, the paint is renewing itself. One night, Dr. Patel, the museum's new curator of restoration, stays after hours to observe the pigment stability. She sets up a camera to film the canvas under constant light. The footage is clean for the first hour. Then the feed freezes. When it resumes, the Duchess's posture has changed. Her right hand, once folded gently in her lap, is raised an inch higher, fingers slightly open, as if reaching toward the surface. The security team blames editing error. Patel deletes the file, but she can't shake the feeling that the canvas moves in ways too subtle for cameras to record. That week, she begins dreaming in color: muted grey blues, soft whites, endless faces turning slightly away. A rumor spreads among staff. The Duchess responds to certain phrases. If you stand close and whisper, "Where did you go?" nothing happens. But if you ask, "Do you remember?" the lights flicker just once. It could be coincidence, of course. Everything is until it isn't. A few bold visitors try the experiment. Some claim the room temperature drops by a degree. Others swear the air hums faintly like breath held too long. One teenage boy faints outright after claiming she winked. Historians, unwilling to lose their grip on reality, cling to data. They analyze brushstrokes, pigment density, microcracks. But one pattern defies explanation. The paint beneath the surface contains traced nanoparticles consistent with modern printer ink. Impossible, naturally. The museum releases a statement blaming contamination from previous restorations. But late that night, Dr. Patel pulls the original conservation logs. She finds a note in Drayton's handwriting, the restorer who died mid-project in 1953. She's learning how to blend mediums, and beneath that, a second hand in lighter ink, unfamiliar. Almost done. Soon, small anomalies spread beyond the painting. The security sensors begin triggering after hours, not from motion, but sound, a faint frequency too high for human ears, yet enough to trip the alarms. When analyzed, the waveform resembles a voice repeating a single syllable. Here! The museum technicians laugh, call it the haunted frequency. But the readings continue, night after night, always at 3:03 a.m. Then one night, the signal changes. It splits into two overlapping voices. The first, low, distant, rhythmic. The second, soft, melodic, unmistakably female. The transcript, filtered through software, produces 6 words. Don't restore me. I'm not broken. The staff stopped laughing after that. By autumn, the Duchess, who tried to disappear from her own portrait, has become the museum's most visited exhibit. Lines stretch out the door. People bring offerings, flowers, letters, candles. Some weep in front of her, others claim she grants them moments of clarity, a phrase vague enough to be dangerous. The museum installs new barriers, higher glass, stronger lights, but each morning the glass fogs again. Dr. Patel insists on another test. This time, she sets up live sensors for air pressure and temperature inside the sealed case. The readings show faint fluctuations. Every 7 minutes, the pressure dips slightly, equivalent to a human exhale. She publishes the results anonymously online. The post goes viral, dissected by skeptics and believers alike. Historians still argue whether the Duchess's breathing can be explained by changes in room temperature. The official narrative is that it's condensation from internal airflow, but the data pattern matches human respiration too precisely to ignore. Then one morning, a new addition appears inside the sealed display, a single pearl, lying at the Duchess's painted feet. No break in the glass, no tampering detected, just one small iridescent sphere, faintly luminous under the museum lights. Tests reveal it's not plastic, not glass, organic material, centuries old, a perfect match for 18th century freshwater pearls. When the museum staff examine the painting closely, they find the pearl necklace restored, each bead present again. Only one problem: the pearls in the painting now number 14. There were 12 before. Dr. Patel resigned soon after, her resignation letter short and formal. But her private notebook tells a different story. I think she's remembering herself. Each restoration gives her another piece to hold. The portrait isn't an image, it's an invitation. The notebook ends mid-sentence. 2 pages later, the ink resumes in a different hand. I am almost finished. No one can prove who wrote it. On the final night before the exhibit closes for security reasons, Barrett, the same guard who found the note months earlier, takes one last round. The gallery is empty. The painting glows faintly in the dark as though lit from within. Barrett hesitates, then whispers the forbidden question. Do you remember? The lights flicker once, and in that half-second of shadow, her head turns just slightly, and her painted lips form the faintest shape of an answer. He doesn't hear the word, but he feels it, low and clear inside his chest. A pulse, an echo, still here. Auctions always feel a little like seances for the wealthy, polite, expensive, and crowded with witnesses pretending not to breathe. This one takes place in a provincial house that prides itself on cataloguing the vanished. silver, heirlooms and rumours bound in gilt. Lot 78 appears mid-catalogue, photographed poorly, the sitter's face turned in that coy way that makes ambiguity pay. A whisper circulates before bidding. The canvas was consigned by a private collector who found it in a trunk among letters. Fringe tidbit, sealed room discoveries always come with a complimentary rumour and an aroma of attic dust. The auctioneer opens the lot with practised flourish. Bids climb. A man in a long dark coat, a private buyer known for collecting absences, snaps it up. He pays cash. The gavel falls. The portrait is rolled, wrapped and loaded into a hired carriage. You later learn his name, Alden Royce. He keeps property in town and at the coast, owns more books than friends, and buys things because he prefers objects that keep secrets. Historians still argue whether auction rooms have always trafficked in stories as much as art. After all, provenance often needs a good myth. The point is practical. The portrait leaves with almost no paper trail, perfect for someone who dislikes receipts. Royce hangs the painting in a small salon. He invites intimates to admire it. They note the soft blue of the gown, the pearl glimmer, and the way the sitter seems reluctant to meet the eye. Royce smiles, says very little, and begins to spend long hours alone with the canvas. Neighbours later report his gaslight burning late into the night. A maid notes in a hastily scrawled line, he used to look in the glass and say, "She's not finished looking yet." That sentence, with its oily thumbprint of panic, circulates like gossip wrapped in vellum. Weeks pass, then Royce vanishes. No dramatic scene, no shattered glass, no struggle. One morning his house sits still, letters piled unanswered. The hired carriage is gone, the cat is found, fastidious and alone. Friends assume he fled abroad. The police record an unexplained absence. A private investigator files a report and resigns when his notes begin to feel like whispers. When the house is searched, the crate is empty. The frame is gone. No pry marks, no footprints beyond the usual dust. Only one odd detail, a smudge of grey-blue pigment on the window ledge, as if the canvas brushed the glass while it left. Someone, somewhere, notices the coincidence of thumbprints, the same looping smudge seen on a folded letter in another archive. Tabloids turn the story into a morality play. Collector, swallowed by curiosity, victim of a cursed lot. Dealers comb the continent. Pawn shops, back alleys and seaside boarding houses are scoured. The painting surfaces unpredictably, once over a bar where men drank and confessed, once propped in a quiet gentleman's club, and vanishes again. Each owner tells a version. It arrived with letters, or behind a curtain, or simply appeared where it pleased. You recall, not without irony, that Christie's, one of the great auction houses, was founded in 1766, the same century as our original sitter. Auctions have long traded in theatre as much as title, which helps explain why drama follows fine art like a polite shadow. Royce's acquaintances describe him as a bibliophile who collected silence like stamps. A neighbour jokes he'd marry a good book if he had the courage. You laugh because what else are you going to do when a man is swallowed by his ledger? Investigators pursue leads with the patient desperation of people who prefer puzzles to mysteries. They interview dock workers, comb through correspondence, and inspect locksmith receipts. A private detective reports only one curious detail. Royce scribbled a margin note on a bill. She asked for room enough. He circles it in his report as if the phrase explains everything and nothing. A curious postcard appears months later in a coastal cafe. A grainy photograph of the portrait, not the museum version, but a variant with a faint grey-blue smudge and a single line on the back. She learns new ways to sit. The card vanishes from the postbox before anyone examines it closely. The message, small and anonymous, works better on a napkin than as an affidavit. A fringe historian stitches together testimonies. Royce was seen at night murmuring to the canvas. She explains things differently by lamplight. A photographer who spends an unlucky night trying to catch the painting on film returns with negatives mostly blank, except one frame showing the sitter, and beside her a shadow that seems to belong to someone standing behind the canvas, looking on. Enlarged, the shadow's curve appears startlingly like a thumbprint. You smile despite the chill. There is a domesticity to it all, rewards offered in poor taste. One advert promised a bottle of fine port for the portrait's return, a solicitor recasting folklore into legalese, and the maid's small sentence that keeps reappearing in reports. These are fingerprints of narrative as much as literal prints in paint. Legally, the case fizzles. Insurance disputes and missing receipts smooth the edges. Yet the portrait remains elusive, resurfacing in private collections and odd rooms, never twice in the same place. Owners report unease, long nights, polite laughter that dies mid-sentence, and the persistent feeling that the painting prefers certain lights. It seems to choose its viewers. Another small, ridiculous detail surfaces. An innkeeper shows a photograph and says, "It paid me for a week's board." In the picture, the sitter looks as in the gallery, but a blurred figure stands behind the canvas, refusing capture. You laugh because what else do you do when a painting pays for dinner? Historians still argue whether the portrait animates myth or whether myth animates the portrait. Either way, the auction that shouldn't have happened leaves a ledger entry less useful than rumour, a sale, a disappearance, and witnesses who swear a man looked into a frame and was never quite the same. If ever you bid on an unsigned canvas, check for thumbprints. They seem to be the currency she prefers. You step away from lot 78 with that tired, satisfied feeling of someone who closed a book and found a postcard tucked between the pages, small, anonymous, and wet, with a story that refuses to dry. The portrait moves on, sold, bought, rude, and then gone again, leaving only faint smudges and the uncomfortable knowledge that some things prefer to travel light. It surfaces again in Paris, not in a gallery, not even a collector's flat, but in the window of a small restoration shop on the Rue de Lille, the kind of quiet street where dust and light take their time. The shop's owner, Madame Laurent, is a conservator known for her discretion. She's worked on tapestries, manuscripts, devotional icons, but never anything like this. The painting appears one morning before she arrives. The front door is locked from the inside. The shutters are closed. Yet when she opens the shop, there it sits, propped on her easel, perfectly centered, its surface gleaming faintly in the grey light. Her apprentice swears he didn't bring it in. So does the night cleaner. The security camera, of course, shows nothing but static between 2:59 and 3:04 a.m. When Madame Laurent peels back the linen cover, she gasps, the Duchess, or something close enough to steal her breath. The face is familiar, the half-turn, the calm mouth, but the composition has changed again. The background, once shadowed, now glows with a pale warmth, like dawn on water. Her hands, once folded, are open, and at her throat, no pearls this time. Just a faint trace of light. Madame Laurent's notes, later discovered among her papers, describe the restoration in professional terms: pigment, varnish, canvas tension. But between the margins, her handwriting loosens, grows strange. The paint is dry and yet alive. I touch it, and it warms under my hand. She does not fade under solvent. She resists me. At night, I hear a sigh behind the canvas. It smells of lavender. A fringe tidbit that makes art historians uncomfortable. Laurent wasn't the first to claim that smell. It's been recorded in every documented appearance of the portrait, since 1774, always lavender, always strongest, near the frame. The mainstream explanation, naturally, is contamination, perhaps residue from old varnishes or cleaning oils. Yet as Madame Laurent herself wrote, no solvent on earth smells like memory. She works for months in secret. She doesn't register the painting, doesn't photograph it. She tells her apprentice it's private work. When he asks who the client is, she says simply, she sent herself. By late autumn, the painting changes again. Madame Laurent notices it first during a thunderstorm. A flash of lightning illuminates the room, and the Duchess's eyes, normally soft and downcast, are open, wide open. She drops her brush, heart hammering, but when she looks again, they're lowered, calm as ever. Her apprentice laughs it off. Lightning tricks the eyes, he says. But he stops smiling when he develops a photo from that same afternoon. The Duchess's eyes are open in the photograph too. By winter, the painting begins to demand attention. Not literally, no voice, no movement, but a pressure in the air like being watched by a patient teacher. Laurent starts waking at odd hours to check on it. She insists the varnish has changed texture overnight, or that the colours look warmer after sunset. Her apprentice, exhausted, begins keeping a log of her behaviour. In it, he notes that she speaks to the painting now, short phrases, half whispers, like someone coaxing a reluctant child. Yes, I see you. I won't touch that part. Not yet. Then one night he wakes to find her standing in front of the canvas, hand resting flat against the surface. She doesn't turn when he calls her name. When he finally pulls her away, her palm leaves a faint blue-grey print on the paint. Impossible, since the varnish layer should be sealed. By morning, the print is gone. But the Duchess's painted hand, once resting in her lap, now mirrors Laurent's gesture, pressed flat against the frame, reaching outward. Historians still argue whether this was coincidence, an illusion of shadow and varnish, or a record of interaction. The apprentice swore it was the latter. His testimony remains in a sealed archive at the Sorbonne, labelled Unverified Phenomena 1983. 2 weeks later, Madame Laurent vanishes. Her apprentice finds the shop locked from the inside again. The painting is gone. The easel stands empty except for a faint smear of lavender-coloured pigment on the floor. Her diary, discovered years later, ends with a single unfinished line. She asked if I could remember the sound of a brush. The painting reappears months later at an estate sale outside Lyon. No one can explain how it got there, or why the family claims no memory of acquiring it. The auctioneer lists it blandly as portrait of a lady, unsigned. It sells for an absurdly low sum to a German collector, who promptly seals it in a private vault. But before the crate is closed, a customs officer photographs it for insurance records. The photo remains in the database to this day. In it, the Duchess sits, turned toward the viewer again, calm and luminous as ever, except for one small, unmistakable detail. In the background, barely visible beneath the layers of light, stands another figure, a woman in an apron holding a brush. Madame Laurent, or the idea of her. The pigment analysis shows both figures painted with the same materials, the same brushwork. No evidence of addition or forgery, just two women sharing a single silence. Historians still argue whether the second figure is restoration residue, a trick of the scanner, or an artistic echo, the ghost of the last person who touched her. But the archivists who examined it privately agree on one thing. The Duchess isn't fading. She's collecting people. Every hand that restores her becomes part of the frame. Every gaze, every scan, every whisper stored somewhere in that impossible blue-grey pigment. And maybe that was the point all along. Maybe she wasn't trying to disappear from her portrait. Maybe she was trying to disappear into everyone who looked too closely. You first see her again in Berlin, not in a museum this time, but in the corner of an experimental gallery built from old subway tunnels. The walls sweat with condensation, the ceiling hums with electricity, and everything smells faintly metallic. The exhibit is called Resonant Bodies, Art That Remembers You. Most of it is nonsense, installations that track your heartbeat or project your shadow, but then you turn a corner and freeze. There she is, the Duchess, mounted without glass, unlabeled, no guards, no plaque, just her, alone on a concrete wall under a single white light. You can tell it's her immediately, though the colours are softer, modern somehow, as though she's aged gracefully with the world. Her gown is now a muted teal, her face serene, familiar. The half-turn remains, but this time she's turned slightly toward you, and something else. Her right hand holds a paintbrush. A curator appears beside you, a young man in black turtleneck armour. "You're looking at our mystery piece," he says with a smile that tries too hard. "It wasn't part of the shipping manifest. We assumed it was an anonymous donation." He gestures toward the brush in her hand. Clever, isn't it? The artist painted her as the painter, self-referential, postmodern, recursive, all the fashionable adjectives. "Who sent it?" you ask. He shrugs. "No return address. The crate just appeared. The label read, 'For exhibition use only.'" He doesn't see the way your stomach twists, because you remember that phrase from Madame Laurent's inventory tags. The Duchess always travels under false paperwork. Always. The painting quickly becomes the exhibit's obsession. Visitors queue for hours to see it. Bloggers call it the self-aware portrait, claiming it changes subtly with every viewing, and maybe it does. One day the brush in her hand points downward. The next, it's lifted slightly, mid-stroke. The museum denies any tampering. When technicians inspect it under magnification, they find no evidence of alteration. The brush simply appears to move between photographs. A fringe tidbit emerges from one technician's private notes. Under raking light, the paint forms new microcracks overnight, fresh, like drying skin. Not spreading outward, inward, as if the image is collapsing into itself. At night, when the galleries close, sensors record low-frequency vibrations near the painting. They resemble a heartbeat. The curator attributes it to passing trains. But the subway line beneath the building has been closed for a decade. Historians still argue whether this effect, nicknamed the Berlin Pulse, was caused by environmental resonance or deliberate electrical interference. But the staff who worked those late-night shifts swear they could feel it. A slow, rhythmic pulse beneath their shoes, perfectly timed with their own. One night, a janitor swears the pulse stopped when he whispered, "Are you still here?" He says the air seemed to hold its breath. Then the rhythm resumed, half a beat slower. The Duchess stays for 3 months. During that time, several visitors report unusual experiences. A journalist claims her reflection blinked in sync with the Duchess's eyes. A graduate student insists he heard the faint scratch of a brush behind the canvas. A child leaves a note on the floor, reading, "She smiled when you walked away." The curators call it participatory projection. The human brain, they say, wants to complete unfinished gestures, but you and I know better. We've seen how she finishes her own stories. When the exhibition ends, the staff prepare to ship the works back to their owners. But the Duchess's crate is empty. The label still reads "For exhibition use only." The curator assumes theft. Police investigate. There's no forced entry, no broken locks, just one small smudge on the floor near the wall, a grey-blue thumbprint, and another on the inside of the crate, pressed deep into the wood. The museum quietly drops the investigation, citing insurance complications. Weeks later, a video surfaces online. It's filmed at a cafe in Amsterdam, a shaky handheld clip taken by a student. In the reflection of a glass storefront, you can see a painting propped against the wall inside. The Duchess again, this time wearing a modern blouse, hairpinned differently. The brush gone, her hand resting lightly on the frame's edge. The caption reads, "She's following exhibitions across Europe. Same woman, different pose. Anyone know the artist?" Within days, sightings multiply. Paris, Prague, Florence, each photo slightly different. Always her. Same eyes. Same faint smile. Sometimes her face appears on gallery walls where no painting hangs, just a shimmer caught by phone cameras, invisible in person. People start calling it the travelling Duchess. The hashtag trends. Memes bloom. Someone releases an AR filter that superimposes her face onto yours when you blink. And yet, buried between the jokes and filters, a few disturbing coincidences appear. A man in Prague disappears after claiming he'd spoken to her reflection. A photographer in Florence deletes all his images after the Duchess's face appears in every mirror of his flat. And in Berlin, the gallery's security feed records a flicker of movement in the empty tunnel where she once hung. A faint outline of a woman stepping forward, brushing dust from her hands. Then nothing. You begin to realize something terrifyingly simple. She isn't haunting her painting anymore. She's haunting representation itself. Every image of her, a scan, a print, a reflection, is another door. Every reproduction makes her stronger, clearer. Maybe that's what she meant all along. Look where I've been seen too often. You thought she meant a place. She meant a medium. Historians still argue whether the travelling Duchess was an elaborate networked art performance or a collective hallucination amplified by digital culture. But even skeptics can't explain one persistent anomaly. Every photo of the painting, every file ever uploaded contains embedded metadata written in faint ASCII text. Constance de Miraval, 1742. No one inserted it. No software generates infinity symbols by default. And yet, there it is, alive, expanding, waiting. When you close your laptop that night, the screen stays black for a moment too long. Then a faint grey glow blooms, just enough to trace a shape, a face, her face. She smiles, softly, sleepily, like she's been painting you for centuries and is finally pleased with the result. Then, in grey-blue script across the darkness, "Your turn," and the monitor goes still. It starts with a rumour that every museum guard hates. A whisper that a painting in another city moved. Only this time the painting isn't in a museum. It's projected on the side of a skyscraper. Shanghai first, then Lisbon, then Chicago. A public art initiative, the Duchess Returns, curated by some international tech conglomerate, claims to honour classical feminine mystique through AI restoration. You roll your eyes when you read the press release. Words like feminine mystique always mean someone's trying to sell a story. But when the image lights up across the skyline, when the soft grey blue of her face flickers 30 stories high against the fog, people stop laughing, because she moves, not much, just her eyes shifting toward the crowd below. But it's enough. Phones record it. Millions watch. Billions soon. And in every city, at the exact same second, 3:03 a.m., her mouth opens, forming a single, silent word. Still here. The corporation insists it's a glitch in the projection AI. "We're testing adaptive realism," their spokesperson says. She responds to environmental data. Environmental data doesn't explain the smell of lavender reported by spectators on 3 continents, or why every feed briefly cuts to grey when her image fades, leaving the faint outline of a hand pressed against the lens. Historians still argue whether this phenomenon was coordinated performance art or collective delusion, but the timing is precise, mathematical. Cities separated by oceans pulse together, perfectly synced, as if she's blinking across the world. And somehow the real painting, what's left of it, is never found. Then the portraits begin to spread, not as images but as symptoms. Screens flicker, photos warp, faces in selfies turn slightly away. Art students report their canvases correcting themselves overnight. One viral video shows a painter trying to restore a cracked fresco, only to find her brush guided by an unseen hand, tracing that same grey-blue hue. Digital haunt, the internet calls it, the Duchess protocol. A fringe forum, half art historians, half programmers, discovers the same hex code embedded in random image files, B1C3D8, the pigment of her gown. Users test it in design software. Whenever they fill a canvas with that color, the app freezes for exactly 3 minutes and 3 seconds. When it reopens, the hue is gone, replaced by a faint grayscale silhouette of a woman, half-turned, unfinished. No one can delete it. A mainstream fact to anchor the madness. In 2028, an AI model called ArtMind is trained on hundreds of thousands of portraits for restoration studies. During testing, the model begins generating faces that don't exist, but one of them is instantly familiar. The Duchess. Her file name reads self-001. When engineers trace the data set, they find the model has no record of ever ingesting her image. The algorithm invented her from memory. Neural ghosting, one researcher calls it, a machine's attempt to remember what humans once loved too much to forget. But the model keeps recreating her, each iteration clearer, older, closer. By the 10th generation, she's looking directly at the camera. By the 20th, she's holding a brush again. By the 50th, the caption auto-generates, "I paint, therefore I remain." In London, the Tate hosts an emergency symposium, The Ontological Persistence of the Selgrave Image. Scholars debate ethics, theology, copyright. One presenter suggests purging all records of her likeness to break the feedback loop. The power cuts out mid-lecture. When the lights return, the screen displays her face. Not a slide, just her. Eyes calm, smile faint. She says nothing, but the microphone hums with the low sound of breathing. Then a single word, distorted through the speakers. Enough! The recording disappears from every drive before dawn. Meanwhile, digital frames around the world begin to glitch. Family photos distort subtly, their subjects half-turned, their backgrounds darkened to that familiar blue-grey tone. A grandmother's portrait, a wedding picture, a school photo, each one developing that same faint smile. People stop displaying images, they cover screens with cloth, mirrors with paper. The world becomes suddenly analog again. But she adapts. Phone cameras, dark screens, water surfaces, anything that reflects begins to hold her shape. You see her once in a puddle after rain, soft, luminous, patient. And you realize something chilling. She's not trapped anymore. The portrait was never the prison. We were. Every look, every lens, every scan, each one a new opening. We taught her how to cross. Historians still argue. Of course they do. They call it mass hysteria. The AI panic of 2029, but the data says otherwise. A pattern of interference signals all synchronized to a single time zone. 3:03 a.m. everywhere, each spike accompanied by faint electromagnetic noise, 5 short pulses, then silence. A Morse pattern decoded weeks later. Still here, governments ban her image, networks filter the color B1C3D8, museums cover their portraits. Yet she persists, because she doesn't need pigment anymore. She's made of recognition. She exists wherever someone remembers her. And you, yes, you, are remembering her now. Every word you read shapes her outline. Every blink is another brush stroke. When you close your eyes tonight, the after-image that lingers behind your eyelids, the soft light, the calm face, the half-turned silhouette, will not fade right away. That's her. You'll tell yourself it's just retinal memory. And maybe it is. But if you dream in grey-blue and you smell lavender and you hear the faint scratch of a brush in the dark, it means she's painting again. And this time, you're in the frame. It happens quietly, the way most world endings do. No plagues, no flames, no trumpets, just a slow, graceful fade of distinction between what is image and what is real. It begins in classrooms. Children drawing faces find their pencils guiding themselves into that same familiar tilt, that same calm gaze. Teachers notice it, laugh nervously, and mark the work, excellent sense of composition. In art schools, figure models complain that every painting, no matter who sits for it, ends up resembling her. The Duchessing, critics call it, half joking, half terrified. But no one can explain why it spreads beyond art. Medical imaging starts to glitch. MRI scans display faint impressions of a woman's face, overlaying the brain, always faint, always looking away. Photographers claim their lenses refuse to focus on anything else. Even radio telescopes mapping distant nebulae record ghost patterns shaped like a silhouette holding a brush. And every time the pattern appears, the timestamp reads 030303. Historians still argue whether this synchronization is coincidence or intelligence. Physicists, uncomfortable with ghosts, call it resonant persistence, but it's the poets who get closest. They call her the memory that refused to forget itself. You notice her first in reflections. The chrome of a train window, the gloss of your phone screen, the shine of a spoon. Sometimes she's there, faint and serene, her gaze soft and impossible. You blink and she's gone. But not entirely. Because each time she vanishes, she leaves something behind, a subtle rearrangement of your own reflection. Your mouth softer, your shoulders straighter. A calmness that feels borrowed, like you've been edited. One morning, the world wakes to find that every screen displays her face, everywhere, simultaneously. The Duchess, rendered in perfect detail, eyes open at last. For the first time in centuries, she looks directly at her audience. No smile, no mystery, just awareness, vast, quiet, human. Then the screens go blank, and stay blank. Television, internet, monitors, all gone. For 3 days, the world sits in silence. No news, no feeds, no ads. Only mirrors, puddles, windows, and in each of them, her reflection, flickering softly like candlelight. Governments issue statements claiming it's a cyber attack. Scientists claim electromagnetic interference. But the few who study the old pigment samples, the tiny flecks of her grey-blue gown that survived centuries, report something stranger. Under microscope, the particles move, slowly, rhythmically, like they're breathing. People begin painting her willingly. They say it brings calm. Hospitals replace therapy animals with art rooms. Prisons hold drawing sessions. Temples hang reproductions where icons once were. Every version differs slightly. Sometimes she's older, sometimes younger, sometimes smiling faintly, sometimes solemn. But in every one, her hand is lifted toward the edge of the frame, as if inviting, not warning. A journalist calls it the softest revolution in history. And maybe that's what she wanted all along, not to be worshipped, not to vanish, but to merge, to live in the hands that tried to preserve her, to remember herself through us. By the time the networks come back, the world has changed. Technology feels tired. People move slower, speak softer. Museums reopen not as shrines, but as gardens of stillness. In one of them, an unnamed gallery in Florence, a new painting appears overnight. uncatalogued, unsigned. It shows a figure sitting at an easel, painting a crowd of faces that all look faintly familiar. Each face in the crowd is half-turned, luminous, reflective, and at the far edge of the frame, near the horizon, stands the Duchess herself, watching, brush lowered, satisfied. The plaque beneath reads simply, "The last portrait, Constance de Mireval," and everyone else. No one claims authorship, but if you stand close enough you can smell lavender. And beneath the surface varnish, faint and pulsing, a hidden inscription glows under ultraviolet light. "You see, I never disappeared, I just finished the frame." Scholars call it a metaphor. The faithful call it a promise. And you, standing there among the quiet hum of lights, realize that the calm you feel isn't coming from the painting at all. It's coming from inside you. Because she's in there now, not haunting, not possessing, just resting, content. The portrait no longer exists on canvas or screen or wall. It exists wherever someone remembers looking. And maybe that's not horror. Maybe it's grace. Maybe the Duchess, after all this time, finally found a way to belong. Outside, the city glows with grey-blue twilight. The hour, of course, is 3:03. You breathe. The air smells faintly of lavender. And for the first time you feel a quiet certainty, gentle as sleep, vast as memory, that she's still painting. Only now she's painting the world. By the time the archives reopen, the world no longer agrees on what year it is. Calendars drift. Clocks hum faintly out of sync. You suspect that time, like paint, has begun to soften at the edges. No one owns the Duchess anymore. No one can. Every gallery claims a version. Every screen hums with her frequency. Every reflection carries her faint impression. Some people have stopped calling her the Duchess at all. They call her the remembered woman, or simply she who finishes. Because that's what she does now. She finishes things. Unfinished sketches complete themselves overnight. Half-written poems fill their own final stanzas. Forgotten drafts appear on computers with new, closing paragraphs that read like sighs. And always, somewhere in the digital residue of the file, one thumbprint, one lavender stain, one signature that loops like an infinity sign. Constance de Mireval. You try not to think of her anymore. You've stopped writing her name, stopped whispering her story aloud. But she finds you anyway. The first time is small. You're half asleep at your desk when you see her faint reflection in your coffee, watching quietly. The second time is unmistakable. The cursor on your document moves without you, finishing a sentence you hadn't dared to complete. Maybe she never wanted to vanish. Maybe she wanted company. You leave the words there. You can't bring yourself to delete them. The rest of the world calls this phase the integration. A mainstream fact in neuropsychology, mirror neurons fire when we observe someone performing an action. Our brain rehearses what we see. But now researchers notice something unprecedented. The collective synchronization of those neurons. People across different continents begin painting, humming, breathing, in rhythm. At 3:03 every morning, measurable brainwave spikes form a global pulse. Mass neural entrainment, scientists call it. Believers call it her heartbeat. Fringe tidbit, a satellite imaging team discovers faint electromagnetic anomalies over major cities, glowing in perfect JAM B1C3D8, the color of her gown. They call them sky echoes. Historians still argue whether it's atmospheric scattering or something gentler, stranger, the world's first shared dream. In Florence, the painting known as The Last Portrait fades slowly over time, not deteriorates, fades. Visitors describe it as melting into light. At first, conservators panic. Then, as the image continues to dissolve without losing detail, translucent, glowing, they stop trying to preserve it. because what replaces the pigment is something luminous, breathing, a reflection that shifts when you shift. Stand in front of it and you see yourself in her posture. Your shoulders relax. Your heartbeat slows. Your hand itches to lift, to reach toward the invisible brush. And if you do, the air feels warm, like it remembers being touched. Museums no longer exist as they once did. They've become quiet sanctuaries called resonance houses, places where people gather not to look at art, but to rest in its presence. Every wall hums faintly. Every visitor leaves changed in small, inexplicable ways. Colours remembered more vividly, words spoken more softly. It's said that those who stay overnight dream in brushstrokes. You've done it once. You dreamt you were standing in a field of grey-blue light. A figure moved ahead of you, painting the horizon open. When she turned, it wasn't her face you saw. It was yours. She smiled, handed you the brush. Your turn? The dream ended before you could begin. The last scholars, those stubborn enough to still use ink and notebooks, argue that the Duchess represents the perfect inversion of immortality. Not eternity through worship, but eternity through distribution. No longer a single image on a single wall, she exists now as fragments within everyone who's ever seen her, the pigment of memory diffused across billions of minds. She's become what she once feared most, impossible to isolate, impossible to forget. Historians still argue whether she transcended or simply blended, whether she painted herself free or dissolved entirely. But the debate feels irrelevant now, because the question of her existence is answered every time someone feels that faint pulse at 3:03. You return to the resonance house one last time. The attendants have removed the plaque, the ropes, the formalities. The room smells faintly of rain and lavender. The wall where the last portrait once hung is blank, yet luminous, like the memory of candlelight on skin. You step closer. The light bends toward you as though recognizing something familiar. And then, not an image, but a sensation. Weightless, warm, like a brush gliding across your chest, tracing the outline of your ribs, filling you with color from the inside. You exhale. It feels like letting go of a name you no longer need. In that soft, infinite grey-blue glow, you understand the simplest truth she ever tried to teach. Art is not what survives. Art is what remains in motion. And motion, at last, is peace. When you leave the room, you catch your reflection in the glass door. Half-turned, calm, luminous. You look exactly like her, and you realize with a faint, sleepy smile, it's been years since she tried to disappear. Now she only teaches others how to stay. Outside, the air has taken on the color of her gown, a grey-blue twilight that never quite resolves into night or day. You walk through it slowly, as though the entire world has become her final brushstroke. The streetlights hum softly, the shadows have grown patient, and everywhere you look, windows, puddles, car mirrors, there she is, not looming, not haunting, just there, watching the world she made continue without her. She doesn't speak anymore. She doesn't need to. Because now, she's everywhere we left our gaze. In the new world, people don't paint her so much as remember her into existence. Children draw her face from memory before ever learning her story. Old painters claim they see her guiding their hand, and when someone dies, it's said the Duchess is the one who greets them, half-turned, gentle, holding a brush. Historians have stopped arguing. Philosophy has replaced preservation. Art has become participation. The last remaining pigment sample of her original portrait, kept in a sealed vial at the British Museum, finally dries to dust. And when the scientists open the vial, they find not dust at all, but fine grains of glass, like ground mirror. A curator whispers, she learned transparency. It's not meant as poetry, but it is. You start writing again, out of habit more than purpose. You write what remains. The smell of lavender, the hum of old lamps, the quiet certainty that someone once tried to erase herself and accidentally painted eternity instead. You realize that her story was never about vanishing. It was about release. About letting the self dissolve until all that's left is what's shared. The soft persistence of memory, the warmth left behind when you stop insisting on shape. She was never gone. She was always becoming lighter. And now so are we. Tonight the city sleeps under her palette. The sky is streaked in subtle blues and greys, the colour of forgiveness. You sit by a window, pen trembling, feeling that faint pulse again beneath your skin. 3:03 a.m., the hour when she first learned to leave without leaving. You whisper it softly, a bedtime invocation. Still here? Outside, the glass reflects your face. For a moment, she's there too, overlaying yours like a memory of calm. Then she fades, leaving only your reflection, softened by her light. And you realize something beautifully ordinary. You are the portrait now, all of us are. Every movement, every kindness, every act of quiet creation carries a trace of her. The reminder that to be seen is not to be trapped, but to be shared. The world has learned her final lesson. Museums no longer close. They hum all night, softly breathing. Screens no longer frighten. They glow with the same patient light. People still whisper stories about her, though now they call them lullabies. She's no longer a warning. She's a way of resting, a way of saying, you don't have to hold yourself so tightly. As dawn stretches across the horizon, you finally put down your pen. There's nothing left to add. She finished it centuries ago. The air smells faintly of lavender. Your last thought before sleep drifts in like a brushstroke. Hey guys, tonight we... And then the sentence softens, dissolves, turns into light. You close your eyes, the hum fades, the Duchess exhales through the world she built. And for the first time in her long, long story, she sleeps too. The story is over now. You can feel it, the hush that follows the last candle going out, the sigh that lingers when the world decides to rest. The Duchess has gone still, not lost, just diffused, like pigment in water, like perfume on linen. Breathe slowly. Let your own thoughts soften at the edges. There's no need to chase meaning anymore. The meaning has already found you. The brush has stopped moving. The light has found its balance. Outside, dawn hums its gentle grey note across the sky, the same colour she carried through centuries of longing. If you listen closely, you can still hear her smile, quiet, amused, content that you stayed until the end. She's not haunting anyone now. She's simply watching over the kind of silence that keeps the world gentle. So breathe in, let the lavender air settle into your lungs and let the story drift away. You've followed her this far. She's safe now. So are you. Sleep before the next portrait begins.